Hey guys, tonight we dive into the mud-caked alleys and foul-smelling corners of a medieval city, because nothing says sweet dreams like imagining your feet sinking ankle-deep into sewage. Picture this. The sky is grey, the smell hits you like a brick wall dipped in manure, and everything you've ever known about comfort, safety, or personal space has just been chucked out a window. Literally, you're surrounded by shouting vendors, clanging metal, stray pigs, and the ever-present stench of things best left unnamed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're falling asleep from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you before the sounds, the chaos, the strangely aggressive pigeons, is the smell. It doesn't ease in politely like a polite cologne. It sucker punches your senses with a bouquet of fish guts, horse droppings, sweat-soaked tunics, and yeah, probably actual human waste. See, medieval cities didn't exactly have a sanitation department, or sewers, or dignity. Streets were narrow, built up haphazardly over the years with no thought to airflow or drainage. Rain didn't wash away the filth. It turned it into soup, a chunky, disease-ridden stew of everything humans and animals could excrete, toss, or die from. And if you thought you'd walk in the middle of the street to avoid getting too close to someone's suspiciously oozing wooden shack, think again. That's where the carts go, and the horses, and the butchers, who just dump today's pile of goat offal directly into your path like some kind of medieval booby trap. Your best bet: hug the wall and hope the chamber pots aren't full tonight. Speaking of walls, let's talk architecture, or rather, its lack. These cities weren't planned, they sprawled. Think of a toddler building a Lego town blindfolded. Buildings leaned drunkenly toward each other, their upper floors nearly touching across alleyways. Fire codes, cute. The truth is, the walls trapped the stink inside, and the fresh air outside. And the only thing more dangerous than stepping into this mess was breathing in it. Now enter Bertram. He's a tanner, and he's the reason the whole block smells like boiled cat skin. Bertram spends his days soaking animal hides in a vile cocktail of water, dog dung, and urine. Why? Because that's how you softened leather back then. Neighbors hate him. Bertram doesn't care. He's got the medieval version of job security. Everyone needs shoes, or at least something vaguely shoe-adjacent to strap onto their plague-blistered feet. By the way, historians still argue whether city residents became nose-blind to the smell or just lived in a constant state of gagging denial. Some writings claim city folk used flowers, herbs, and even dried orange peels to combat the miasma. Others insist everyone just stank in harmony. Now, back to your arrival. Let's say you're lucky enough to be wearing boots. Doesn't matter, you're slipping. The mud isn't just mud, it's waste. And maybe, if your stars are cursed, there's a dead rat in there. Welcome to the city, where vermin are as abundant as gossip, and probably cleaner. And don't get too attached to clean water either. Wells? Contaminated. Rivers. The same ones folks dump waste into and draw water from. There's a reason people drank so much ale. Fermentation killed some bacteria. It also killed your liver. But hey, pros and cons. This is the backdrop of your urban dreamscape. Rotting meat on display next to baked goods. Moldy walls covered in flypaper made of actual honey and pig's blood. A neighbor who thinks bathing more than twice a year invites disease. And the general understanding that if you hear screaming at night, you probably don't investigate. That's someone else's problem, probably Bertram's again. So, why live here at all? Simple. Safety in numbers. Or at least, that's the theory. Bandits liked the open roads, and the countryside was full of wild animals, desperate peasants, and possibly the devil himself. The city, it promised walls, commerce, work, a place to buy, sell, survive. It also promised disease, filth, fire, and death. But you take what you can get. You're beginning to realize this isn't just one bad day. This is life. This is the best case scenario for millions of people for centuries. There's no sanitation, no clean drinking water, and definitely no escape from the reek of old cheese and decomposing turnips mashed underfoot. And as the sun sets, the stink doesn't go away. It settles, thickens. Wait, you don't belong here, not really. But then again, neither did anyone else. They just didn't have a choice. You don't even have time to adjust to the stink before the real horror of medieval city life squelches under your feet. Literally, human waste. Everywhere. Think of it as the city's most loyal inhabitant. Streets weren't paved, sewage systems were still centuries away, and flushing toilets, that was sorcery reserved for distant unknown gods. In most medieval cities, the streets served every purpose it shouldn't. Sidewalk, drain, garbage chute, public restroom, and occasionally grave. It's not that people wanted to live in squalor, it's that they didn't have much say. Let's meet Agnes, a widow with 3 kids and one dangerously tilted house on the edge of the butcher's quarter. She wakes before dawn to throw the night's contents of the chamber pot out the window, like everyone else. But there's etiquette, supposedly. Yell Gardilu before dumping to warn any passers-by. Problem is, everyone yells it at the same time, so it's less of a helpful warning and more of a cacophony of impending doom. One step outside your home and you're navigating ankle-deep sludge made of rotted food, blood, ash, dung, and God knows what else. Medieval chroniclers described the streets as black rivers in the wet season and crackling fields of crust in the dry. That's right, you either slipped in it or crunched over it. The City of London passed regulations about keeping the streets clean as early as the 13th century, but they were mostly ignored. Why? Because cleaning required effort, manpower, and shovels that weren't already broken in half from overuse. Also, who wants that job? No one. So the waste piled up, sometimes literally. In places like Paris, certain streets became so clogged with refuse that carts would tip and horses would refuse to pass. And honestly, who could blame them? Let's talk about the waste management strategy of the average medieval home. None. The toilet, or privy, was often just a hole dug in the corner of the yard, assuming you even had a yard. Most homes had a chamber pot, a ceramic bowl you relieved yourself in, then emptied out the window or into the street. And if you were lucky, you lived near a cesspit, a deep hole to collect waste, which some unfortunate soul had to dig out once it filled up. That man, often called a gong farmer, paid well, smelled worse. And here's your fun fringe tidbit. Archaeologists have found entire layers of compacted human waste under cities like York and London. Literal fossilized filth. It tells us more about medieval diets and parasites than any manuscript ever could. So if you're wondering how closely medieval people lived with their bodily byproducts, the answer is intimately, lovingly, nightmarish. Now toss in some pigs. Yes, pigs. They were the unofficial garbage collectors of the Middle Ages. Families would keep them tethered or not, so they could roam the streets, snuffling up garbage, spoiled meat, dead rats, and occasionally smaller animals. Sometimes children, okay, not often, but enough to spark bans in some cities. Pigs were considered living sanitation systems, and they were shockingly efficient. Problem was, they were also huge, strong, and occasionally homicidal. Historians still argue whether city authorities genuinely believed pigs were helping with sanitation, or if it was just an excuse to not clean the streets themselves. Either way, pigs were there, snorting, charging, eating. If you lived near a butcher, or worse, a tannery, you had to contend with rivers of blood and discarded organs flowing freely down your street. Some butchers tried to be tidy, dumping entrails into nearby rivers instead. Very thoughtful. The Thames in London, for instance, was often described as frothing with blood. That's the same river people drank from, bathed in, washed clothes in. You see the problem. Enter Thomas the tax collector. He slips on a gut pile outside a butcher's stall and breaks his leg. No one helps. Why would they? He's a tax collector, but also, everyone's seen worse. Earlier that week, a cow carcass exploded from heat in the middle of the road. The city just kept moving. Thomas lies in the street, moaning, covered in what may or may not be pig urine, as kids run by barefoot and screaming. Welcome to civic life. Let's not forget the Butcher's Hill, an actual mound of bone refuse, sometimes stories high, that built up year after year because no one disposed of bones properly. They were just stacked. Historians note that some of these bone mounds turned into landmark hills. Imagine using a pile of rote as your navigational reference. Go past the bone hill, hang left at the dead dog, and you're there. And when it rained, the smell got worse. Moisture didn't cleanse, it reactivated. Everything that had crusted over, sun-baked into some unholy jerky of human discharge, now turned back into sludge. Shoes were useless. Cloth dragged through the filth. Skirts soaked up liquids of suspicious origins. Your laundry never stood a chance. And neither did your soul. Still think you'd want to visit? Think again. Or better yet, think about what medieval folks wore to navigate all this. No rubber boots. No waterproof anything. Just leather, wool and prayer. Mostly prayer. Oh, and wooden clogs which could crack, trip you or trap your foot in the very thing you were trying to avoid. By this point, you've only taken 10 steps outside your house, and you're already knee-deep in history's worst sidewalk. But you know what's wild? People adapted. They normalized it. It became background noise, background smell, background disease. The price you paid for proximity to work, trade, and a slice of bread that maybe didn't have mold on both sides. And if all else failed, you held your breath. Not from fear, just from the air itself. You're walking down a medieval street, dodging rats and puddles of unmentionables, when suddenly, splash, it came from above. You didn't see it coming. You never do. A warm, foul-smelling blob lands squarely on your shoulder. It's chamber pot hour, again. In most medieval cities, people didn't have bathrooms. They had pots, ceramic bowls, usually kept under the bed, filled over the course of a long, grimy night. In the morning, or whenever it suited them, they'd open their window and hurl its contents onto the street below. Gravity did the rest, and if you happened to be passing by at the wrong time, congratulations, you're now wearing someone else's dinner, digested and partially fermented. They were supposed to yell first. Gardez-l'eau, a garbled echo of the French regardez-l'eau, meaning, watch out for the water. Cute, right? But most people either forgot, didn't care, or assumed the warning would reach anyone who mattered. Spoiler, it did. Now meet Matilda, a cranky woman with 4 missing teeth and 0 patience. She's lived in this crooked building her whole life, and she's developed a habit of skipping the gardez-l'eau part entirely. One morning, a visiting friar ends up baptized in her chamber pot contents while blessing her neighbor's door. The incident is recorded in a city ledger under disruption of religious decorum. Matilda was fined a loaf of bread. The friar, probably still recovering. This was everyday life. A simple stroll could turn into a splash zone of horror, with no warning. Cities like Edinburgh and York even had laws on the books about when and how to dump waste, but enforcement was rare. After all, who wanted to be the one patrolling poop hour? Historians still argue whether the gardez-l'eau tradition was universally practiced, or mostly myth. Some sources insist it was as common as sunrise. Others suggest it was romanticized in later retellings. Either way, the reality was the same. The streets below were always suspect. Of course, there were those who tried to be discreet. In some homes, the chamber pot contents were carried downstairs and emptied into a gutter or directly into a nearby river. This sounds cleaner until you realize that same river was where people got their water. Drinking water, bath water, soup water. And if your house didn't have a chamber pot, you went outside, wherever you could. In cities with narrow alleys, people relieved themselves between buildings or behind piles of firewood. You'd see women crouching in the early morning, dresses discreetly lifted, praying for privacy. Men, being men, just found a wall and made their mark. Then there were the nightmen, brave or desperate souls paid to carry human waste out of the city in large buckets, usually at night to avoid the smell. They dumped it outside the walls or into massive cesspits. Sometimes they fell in, sometimes they survived. Usually they did. Speaking of cesspits, let's talk about Walter. Walter worked at the edge of the city emptying these stinkholes. One day, he dropped his ladle in and reached too far. In he went. It took 4 men and a rope to get him out. When asked what it was like, Walter reportedly said, "It's warmer than it looks." A medieval sense of humor, folks, still alive in the muck. Now, if you were really fancy, you might have a garderobe. That's right. A toilet that emptied straight out of the wall and down the side of the building. No pipes, no plumbing, just a wooden seat, a hole, and a long drop to the street. Some castles even had multiple garderobes, side by side, like a royal restroom with a view. But back in the city, these features were rare. Most people just coped with the constant risk of airborne excrement. If your hood got hit, you didn't scream, you sighed, muttered something about saints, and tried to shake it off. It wasn't if it would happen, but when. Open windows were another hazard. During warmer months, people left shutters open to let in the breeze, only to be hit by the stench of their neighbors' contributions. And since buildings leaned into each other, sometimes your neighbor's waste ended up, well, not where it was supposed to. There are documented cases of mid-air chamber pot collisions, resulting in both feuding neighbors and suspiciously slippery rooftops. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval cities experimented with fines for improper dumping. In 14th century Paris, you could be fined several sous if caught throwing waste without warning. Repeat offenders were named publicly, a sort of proto-cancel culture. Imagine being known around town as Pisspot Peter. That stuff stuck longer than the stink. And yes, people tried to clean up. City officials hired men with carts and shovels to clear the muck, especially before royal visits or festivals. But these efforts were fleeting. Rain undid their work. Crowds ignored barriers. Chamber pots never stopped. One traveler in the 15th century described walking through a city where the air was heavy, the ground was alive, and the sky was full of curses. That wasn't poetic exaggeration. That was Tuesday. So, as you stand there scraping your boot against a rock and wondering if the smell will ever come out of your only cloak, remember, the real terror of medieval life wasn't the plague, or fire, or famine. It was gravity, and someone else's dinner, and the silent prayer that today you might make it down the street without needing a full-body rinse in vinegar and tears. You're dehydrated, sweating under layers of wool that itch like 1,000 tiny lies, and your throat feels like someone stuffed it with chimney soot. Time for a drink. Right? Well, good luck, because in a medieval city, drinking water was a gamble that often ended in dysentery, vomiting, or a very sudden funeral. See, clean water wasn't really a thing. Rivers, those shimmering lifelines we romanticize today, were more like open sewers with scenic views. Most of them doubled as trash chutes, slaughterhouse drains, and the final resting place for anything from fish guts to rotten fruit to, yes, the occasional body. And yet, people still drank from them. Let's take a walk with Osric, a young apprentice blacksmith. After hours of hammering iron in a cramped soot-covered shop, he's parched. He wanders down to the nearest public fountain, which thankfully is fed by a cistern and not the main river. But there's a line, a long one, and the man in front of him just dropped his leather water pouch into the trough, where it promptly sank next to a dead squirrel. Osric stares, pauses, and fills his own pouch anyway. Why? Because that's the best he's gonna get. Now if you're wondering, why didn't they just boil it? Great question. They could, but fuel, wood, coal, peat was expensive. Firewood took time to gather, and people used it sparingly for cooking. You didn't waste it just to make your water less lethal, unless you were already sick, and by then, well, too late. So instead, people turned to beer. Not the frothy IPA sipping on a patio kind, but weak, flat ale, barely alcoholic, always cloudy, and occasionally full of floaty bits. Kids drank it, pregnant women drank it, the elderly drank it, because it was safer than water. Not healthy, but safe-ish. And then there's small beer, a low-alcohol brew often made at home, typically by women. Enter Beatrice, a brewer's wife with 9 children and 0 time for nonsense. She brewed small beer in a soot-blackened kettle, flavored with herbs and sometimes thinned with rainwater. Her house always smelled like barley and wet feet. Her kids, rarely sober, technically, but at least they weren't dead. Historians still argue whether the alcohol in small beer was enough to kill most waterborne diseases, or if it was just diluted enough to delay the diarrhea. Some believe the yeast and fermentation process helped. Others think it was psychological, a placebo effect powered by centuries of desperation. Either way, ale was life. If you were wealthy, maybe you had options. Some rich folk had private wells, which they guarded like dragons. Others paid to have barrels of clean water brought in from outside the city by cart. But those barrels weren't sealed, and the longer they sat, the greener they got. Still, for a price you could drink something that didn't smell like wet sheep. Oh, and speaking of wells, those were risky too. City wells often got contaminated from nearby cesspits. Sometimes people threw dead animals into them. Sometimes they fell in themselves. In Nuremberg, a dog fell into a public well and wasn't discovered for weeks. People kept drinking the water. Several died. The city council eventually sealed the well and built a new one, right next to the tannery. Fun fringe tidbit. In medieval Norwich, officials once installed wooden pipes to bring in water from a spring outside the city. It was hailed as a miracle of engineering, until rats chewed through the pipes and the spring dried up. Progress. Now let's talk about the truly desperate. Those who drank puddle water. Rainwater wasn't safe either. Not when it collected on roofs coated in soot, bird droppings, and bits of thatch. But if you were dying of thirst, you didn't ask questions. You slurped, you prayed, and you hoped your next cough didn't signal something serious. Enter Wilfred, a rag picker, who worked the alleys near the fish market. He never had access to fresh water. His hands were always covered in something vaguely organic, and his flask smelled like boiled eggs left in the sun. One day, he drank from a broken barrel someone left outside the tavern. It tasted like old cabbage. He said nothing. He lived another week. Some religious institutions tried to help. Monasteries often had their own wells and occasionally shared water with the poor. But lines were long, the monks were cranky, and you needed to look properly miserable to be allowed in. Snot on your cloak helped. And then there were rain barrels. These were the medieval version of water tanks, set under eaves to collect rainwater, often covered with planks to keep out birds. Mostly, but again, standing water breeds mosquitoes, slime and floating surprises. One London document from 1327 describes a woman screaming because her rain barrel had a head in it. The record doesn't specify whether it was human or animal. Either way, effective appetite suppressant. You'd think people would revolt, demand sanitation, protest for cleaner water, but they didn't, because they didn't know better. The idea of invisible bacteria didn't exist yet. Disease was bad air, or divine punishment, or that weird guy across the street who never went to church. Water was just another roll of the medieval dice. So, when your lips are cracked and your tongue feels like burlap, you've got a choice. River muck, questionable rainwater, or ale that tastes like bread. Someone cried into, if you're lucky, the ale won't kill you. If you're really lucky, it'll at least dull the stomach cramps. Drink up. You're still parched, but now you're hungry too. And that's when you make your second terrible decision of the day, heading to the marketplace. If you're expecting food stalls bursting with colorful produce and clean counters, you're about to meet disappointment wearing a butcher's apron. The medieval market was loud, crowded, and pungent in all the wrong ways. Meat sat unrefrigerated in the open air for hours, sometimes days. Fish twitched on slabs of sun-warmed stone, often long after they stopped being technically edible. Bread was better. If you didn't mind a little sawdust, you approach a meat seller. His name is Harold, and his beard is majestic, but suspiciously greasy. He offers you a slab of pork that's been sitting out since sunrise. It's covered in flies, and when he lifts it, the color underneath is not great. You ask if it's fresh. He shrugs. Was walking yesterday, he says. You buy it anyway. Why? Because the alternative is whatever the rats didn't finish behind the fishmonger's stall. Let's talk preservation, or lack thereof. In warmer months, meat spoiled fast. There were no ice boxes. Salt was precious and expensive, so vendors got creative. They'd rub the surface of old meat with spices or charcoal to mask the smell. Some used wine or vinegar to make it seem fresher. Others just hoped you were too hungry to care. The wealthier folks had slightly better options: smokehouses, salting cellars, or, if you were really rich, snow brought down from the mountains. But for the average city dweller, meat was a gamble wrapped in a prayer. Eat too early, and it's tough. Wait too long, and it's botulism in a crust. Historians still argue whether these markets operated on a system of honest barter or shameless fraud. Truth is, it was a bit of both. Reputation mattered. If too many people died after eating your sausage, word got around. But there were no health inspectors. No licenses if a seller got caught peddling rotten goods. The worst they faced was public shaming, or having their wares dumped on their head. Literally. Let's not forget our fringe fact for tonight. Some bakers bulked up their flour with powdered bones, chalk or clay. That's right, dirt bread. Easier to shape, harder to digest. There's even mention of one London baker who was fined for selling bread with plaster. His defense: it makes the crust crunchy. No one laughed. Vegetables weren't much better. Most were wilted from sitting in the sun. Some were sprayed with questionable liquids to look fresher. And fruits? Expensive, seasonal, and usually crawling with something small and alive. You'd think apples would be safe, until you bite into one and find a worm longer than your index finger. Let's pause to meet Edith, a street seller who walks with a limp and sells something called meat pie. No one knows what kind of meat. Sometimes even she's not sure. Her secret? Spice. Just enough cloves and onions to confuse the tongue. She makes a killing. Literally, and don't expect change. Coins were scarce, heavy, and easily clipped, meaning folks would shave off bits of silver and spend the lighter coin as if it were full value. Market sellers often weighed your money before accepting it. If it was too light, you got nothing. Worse, they might accuse you of fraud and call the constable, and trust me, that guy has no interest in nuance. A good meal in a medieval city was an illusion. It smelled good from a distance, roasting chestnuts, fried onions, honey cakes, but up close it was chaos. Grease fires, grease fingers, grease floors. Food dropped on the ground, got brushed off, and resold. Hands were unwashed, knives were licked clean. And you were just trying to stay alive, and not eat something that made your teeth fall out. Now let's talk about the communal cup. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. A shared drinking vessel, passed around at market stalls, inns and street corners. Want a sip of watered ale? So did the coughing man before you, and the snot-nosed child, and Edith. Bon appetit. And for dessert, there were sweetmeats, candied nuts, dried fruits rolled in honey, and occasionally a mysterious paste that tasted vaguely of cinnamon and despair. Sugar was rare and expensive, so most sweets were actually just slightly less sour versions of regular food. But if you had a coin or two and low standards, you could finish your meal with something sticky and vaguely celebratory. Let's not forget spoilage wasn't just a risk, it was a certainty. If your food wasn't spoiled now, it would be by sundown. That's why most people bought small amounts and cooked quickly. Even so, people got sick. A lot. Food poisoning was common and often fatal, especially when your immune system was already wrecked from bad water and no sleep. Remember that butcher, Harold. One winter, he tried to sell dried meat he'd left hanging in his shop too long. It developed a thick grey fuzz. His wife suggested shaving it off. He tried. It squelched. He sold it anyway. 3 people died. He moved to another district and changed his name. As far as we know, he's still selling beef. So next time you grumble about stale chips or a weird-looking tomato at the grocery store, remember, in the medieval marketplace, you'd be thrilled just to find bread that didn't crunch when it wasn't supposed to. You finally make it home after your culinary misadventure, clutching a possibly toxic meat pie and a bruised apple with mysterious bite marks. You open your door and promptly trip over a bucket because your home, like most medieval city dwellings, was not designed for comfort, safety, or even basic geometry. It was, in short, a fire trap. Let's start with the walls. They were wood. The floors? Wood. The furniture? Wood. The ceiling beams? Also wood. And the cooking? Done over an open flame. See the problem? Medieval cities were tinderboxes waiting for a bad mood and a candle to collide. You live in what's called a wattle and daub structure. That means woven wooden sticks packed with a mixture of mud, straw, animal dung, and occasionally human hair. It's surprisingly durable until it isn't. It gets damp, it cracks, rats love it, fire really loves it. Meet Aldwin, your upstairs neighbor. He's He's a cooper by trade, barrel maker by misfortune. One evening, he falls asleep after a few too many mugs of small beer, leaves a candle burning, and accidentally drops a cloth near the hearth. Within minutes, his thatched roof is ablaze. Within an hour, 5 homes are gone. The street is renamed Ash Alley. Aldwin survives, but no one talks to him again without spitting first. Fire wasn't just a threat, it was a weekly event. Cities like London, Rouen, and Cologne burned so frequently that entire quarters vanished overnight. Some mayors tried to pass laws, no thatch, wider streets, fire buckets on hand, but enforcement was loose, and people were poor. Thatch was cheap, wood was everywhere. Clay tiles were for the rich, so the fires kept coming, and the buildings weren't just flammable, they were dangerously unstable. Upper floors often jutted out over the street, in a style called jettying. It looked cool, but structurally, nightmare fuel. Builders used cheap materials, unregulated labor, and zero math. Homes sagged, creaked, and occasionally collapsed. When it rained, water poured through the roof. When it snowed, beams snapped. Historians still argue whether the average medieval home lasted more than 20 years before needing massive repairs. Some lasted longer, patched, propped up, and prayed over. Others simply fell apart, often with people still inside. Let's look at your floor. It's not wood, too expensive. It's packed earth, strewn with rushes and herbs. Sounds charming until you realize those rushes trap every crumb, droplet, and insect that comes through your door. They changed once a year. Maybe, and they smell like betrayal and wet dog. You might have one window, covered in oiled parchment. Glass is rare and stupidly expensive. The window doesn't open, and neither does the air inside your home. It's thick with smoke from your hearth, body odor from your entire family, and the lingering aroma of salted fish that never truly leaves. Let's talk sleeping arrangements. You share a bed with at least 2 other people, siblings, parents, or both. Mattresses are stuffed with straw or old rags. If you're lucky, no lice. If you're not, congratulations, you're a moving buffet. Blankets are wool, heavy, scratchy, always damp. Now meet Ingiltrude, an elderly midwife who lives across the alley. Her house leans so far left it's practically horizontal. She keeps a bucket of sand by the door in case of fire, and a jug of vinegar in case of rats. Neither works. Last spring, her ceiling caved in while she was boiling herbs. She survived. Her cat didn't. People stored everything they owned in their 1 or 2 rooms. Tools, food, clothing, even animals. Chickens lived under beds. Goats were tethered by the hearth. Everything smelled of smoke, sweat, and Haysar desperation. And if your neighbor's wall was thin enough, you could hear them snoring, or worse. Then there's lighting. No electricity, obviously. You used rushlights, thin wax-dipped reeds, or candles made from tallow. Tallow was rendered animal fat. It smoked, it stank, it dripped everywhere. It was also a major fire hazard, but it beat stumbling into the hearth in pitch-black night. And how do you stay warm? With fire, of course, and layers. You wore your clothes to bed, under a heavy blanket, curled against whoever was closest. Heating more than one room was impossible. In winter, people huddled in the kitchen. In summer, they opened the door and tried not to suffocate. Let's not forget the privy situation. You might have one, outside, over a pit that freezes in winter and steams in summer, or you might just have a bucket. Either way, there's no privacy and no guarantee it won't overflow or collapse. Ask Bartram the baker. His outhouse gave way one rainy night, and he didn't surface until morning. He smelled like legend. Quirky detail. Some cities outlawed thatch entirely. London tried in the 13th century, but enforcement was laughable. People just covered the thatch with mud and said it was transitional roofing. Inspectors gave up, and building codes, non-existent. You built where you could, with what you had, and hoped your wall didn't become your neighbor's new doorway. Some homes even had shared support beams. When one collapsed, 3 went with it, like a very tragic game of Jenga. So here you are, inside your fire-prone, rat-sharing, structurally questionable house, staring at a flickering rushlight and hoping Aldwin doesn't start drinking again. You hear coughing in the alley, a chicken squawking underfoot, and the wind pushing smoke back down your chimney. But you're home, and if it hasn't burned down by morning, that counts as a win. You might think that after surviving airborne waste, questionable stew, and a roof made of broken promises, your night couldn't get worse. But as the sun sets and the city darkens, a new reality settles in. There's no such thing as safe sleep in a medieval city, because guess what? There are no police. None. Not even the illusion of them. Once the marketplace shutters, the ale stops flowing, and the candlelight flickers out, the city becomes someone else's territory. Thieves, drunks, arsonists, and anyone angry enough to settle scores with a dagger and a prayer. And they operate in near-complete darkness. The streets are black, silent, and deeply unsettling. Enter Reeve Martin, the city night watchman. He's got one eye, half a lantern, and a stick. That's the whole force. Martin's job is to walk the major streets, ringing a bell every few hours and muttering something vaguely reassuring. All's well, he whispers, while 3 men rob a bakery behind him. Martin isn't paid enough to intervene, and even if he wanted to, his stick isn't exactly tactical gear. The medieval city didn't have organized law enforcement. Instead, it relied on a mess of unpaid volunteers, angry neighbors, and self-policing via gossip and torches. If someone was caught in the act, the community would swarm like bees on a dropped sweetmeat. But if you screamed into the void at 2 a.m., good luck. That's why people locked themselves in at night. Wooden bolts slid into place, shutters slammed shut, families huddled together. But locks weren't standardized. Sometimes just a latch or a loose stone wedged in a doorframe. It kept honest people out. It didn't slow down anyone determined. Let's meet Ellen, a widow with a soft spot for stray cats and a dangerous habit of leaving her door ajar. One night, a man enters, drunk and confused, convinced he's in his cousin's house. Ellen wakes to find him snoring on her floor with a stolen sausage in one hand. She shoos him out with a broom. He leaves. Nothing is reported. Because to whom would she report it? Historians still argue whether this lack of police presence contributed to a stronger community bond, or just an unspoken social pact of don't die too loudly. Some records suggest neighbors genuinely helped each other. Others show communities rife with petty theft, revenge arson, and midnight screamfests. And if someone was caught stealing or assaulting, medieval justice wasn't about investigation. It was about spectacle. The accused might be dragged to the market square, tied to a post, and whipped, pilloried, or worse. Public shaming was considered not only effective, but entertaining. Kids threw cabbages, adults laughed. The message was clear: behave or bleed. Let's not forget about organized crime. Yep, it existed. Some cities had full-on gangs, roving packs of men who extorted merchants, robbed travelers, and occasionally bribed local officials. One group in 14th century Paris was so bold they printed fake city seals to stage counterfeit tax collections. They wore cloaks, carried swords, and called themselves the Order of the Night. Sounds noble, smelled like onions and fear. Now, back to you, inside your questionable home. You're lying awake, listening. Every creak could be a break-in, every thump might be someone climbing the outside wall, and your only real defense, a sharp stick under the bed, and maybe the dog, if it hasn't run off to chase rats again. And even if no one enters your home, violence finds you. Brawls broke out nightly, between drunks, between neighbors, between rival guild members arguing over soap recipes. Fights started, over spilled ale, misheard insults, and imagined slights. There were no referees, just fists, knives, and a healthy chance of getting trampled. And let's talk about fire again. Remember Aldwin, the candle-happy neighbor. He's snoring now, dangerously close to a woolen curtain. You stare at your wall, listening for that telltale crackle. If it starts, you'll have less than 2 minutes to grab your children, your bread, and maybe your shoes. And outside, the streets are ruled by shadows. City gates are locked at night. No one gets in, and no one gets out. If the city catches fire, you're trapped. If bandits breach the walls, still trapped. If your house collapses and you need help, also trapped. Your only hope lies in the morning light. When vendors reopen, gossip begins, and the illusion of normal returns. But until then, you wait. Silent, alert, breathing through your mouth to avoid the smell of your own fear and the stew pot you forgot to scrub. So if you thought nighttime was for rest, think again. In the medieval city, it's just a quieter, darker kind of danger. You've made it through the night. Congratulations, that already puts you ahead of the curve. But now you wake to the soft scratching of claws and the faint, unmistakable sound of squeaking. It's not the neighbor's baby, it's rats. Again, rats weren't just a problem in medieval cities. They were the problem. They owned the streets, the walls, the grain sacks, the beds, and occasionally the soup. These weren't your cute, pink-nosed cartoon rats. They were thick, matted, and fearless, and they came in numbers that made nightmares feel underpopulated. Let's meet Wimund, a grain merchant who stores his wares in a small wooden shed near the edge of the marketplace. One morning he finds his sacks gnawed open and his best wheat soaked in rat urine. He weeps, not because of the loss, but because he knows he'll still have to sell it. He just mixes the top layer with a bit of fresh grain and tells customers it was blessed during the night. They thank him, then throw up later. Rats went wherever food was, which in medieval cities was everywhere and nowhere. Homes, marketplaces, inns, monasteries. They all offered something delicious to a rat. Crumbs, bones, dried fruit, and human waste. Especially human waste. Rats were practically sanitation workers. If sanitation workers also bit you in your sleep and carried plague, and yes, the plague. Let's address the elephant-sized rodent in the room. Black Death, 1347. You've probably heard the story. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried Yersinia pestis. And within a few years, half of Europe was coughing blood into a handkerchief that hadn't been washed since last Christmas. The medieval city was a perfect incubator. Tight spaces, filth, zero understanding of germs, and rats in every shadow. Historians still argue whether rats were the primary culprit or just part of a broader microbial horror show. Some suggest that human fleas and lice were just as deadly. Others believe the disease mutated into a pneumonic form, spreading through coughs and conversation. Either way, rats were everywhere, and none of them paid rent. Fringe detail. In some cities, rats were so bold they attended executions. No joke. They'd gather beneath the gallows, chewing discarded food and other droppings. People noticed. A monk in Lubeck once described black shadows dancing beneath the hanged men's boots. Romantic, if you're into doom poetry, and you couldn't just get rid of them. Cats helped if you had one. But cats were also associated with witchcraft. During some periods, people actually killed cats to ward off evil, which only made the rat problem worse. It's what scholars now call a spectacularly bad idea. Then there were dogs, good in theory, but most medieval dogs were too busy biting people or fighting over bones to care about rats. They barked, sometimes, and that was about it. Ferrets were used by the clever few, stuffed into tunnels or behind barrels to flush out vermin, but mostly it was you versus them, and they had numbers, agility, and disease on their side. Let's not forget Agnes, an old woman who lived near the tanneries. She claimed to have made peace with her rats, left them scraps, named them, said they warned her when strangers came near. One day, a traveling friar stayed in her home and woke up with 2 rat bites and a fever. He called her a heretic. She shrugged. "They've never bitten me," she said. City officials tried their best. Sort of rat catchers were hired. Men with sticks, sacks, and questionable hygiene. They'd patrol the alleys, clubbing anything that moved. Then they'd demand payment in the form of bread, ale, or coin. Some cities even offered bounties, a penny per rat tail. This led to, you guessed it, rat tail fraud. People bred rats in secret just to kill them for the bounty. Capitalism, medieval style. And when you slept, you didn't. Not really. You heard them scratching in the rafters, in the walls, under the bed. You felt the pitter-patter of tiny feet. And once, just once, you felt a nibble on your toe. You kicked. You prayed. You rolled over and accepted that one of you might not make it to morning. You couldn't poison them. Not effectively. Most poisons available at the time were just herbs and superstition. Some people sprinkled ash. Others burned lavender. One man in Prague swore by onion juice and goat tears. None of it worked. The rats laughed. Probably. And it wasn't just rats. Let's not give fleas a free pass. They were everywhere too. You didn't notice them until you started scratching. Then you always noticed them. They lived in your clothes, your bedding, your hair. They jumped between people on carts and at church, and they carried gifts, blood diseases, rashes, misery. In many ways, you were a hotel for fleas, lice, mites, and rodents. You provided the warmth, the blood, the food crumbs, and the real estate, and they repaid you with scratching, bleeding, and the occasional pandemic. So when you see a rat dart across the floor, remember, you are not the homeowner, you are the tenant. The rats own this block. They've seen fires, floods, invasions, and funerals. And they're still here. Sleep tight. You'd think after surviving a night of scratching, squeaking, and the quiet, soul-numbing fear of becoming plague statistics, the sun might bring relief. Nope. Morning in a medieval city doesn't come with hope. It comes with coughing. Loud, wet, bone-rattling coughing. Because in a city without sanitation, medicine, or basic understanding of infection, disease wasn't rare. It was routine. Everyone's sick. All the time. And if they're not, they probably will be by Thursday. Meet Hugo. He's 25. A cooper's apprentice. And already looks 50. His face is pockmarked from childhood smallpox. He coughs blood into a handkerchief every morning. His hands shake, but he still goes to work. Because missing a day means no money, no food, and no mercy. That's the thing. Being ill didn't excuse you. People still worked through fevers, toothaches, boils, infected wounds, and the slow creeping onset of what we now recognize as tuberculosis. Because what choice did they have? You either kept moving, or you didn't make rent. And by rent, we mean a leaky floor and a corner to collapse in. The most common killers weren't dramatic like the Black Death. They were banal: dysentery, typhoid, cholera, the bloody flux, all charming names for what happened when you drank the wrong water or ate meat that stared back at you. And in a city where chamber pots decorated every window and butchers dumped organs in the street, the odds of not contracting something grotesque were impressively low. And here's the kicker: no one understood why people got sick. Germ theory. Still a few centuries away, people blamed bad air, also known as miasma. If it smelled foul, it must make you ill. So to cleanse the air, folks burned herbs, carried posies, or dabbed vinegar-soaked cloths under their noses. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it gave people something to do while they died. Now let's talk about doctors. If that word conjures up images of wise, educated men healing with care and precision, delete that. Replace it with confident guesswork and dangerous accessories. The average medieval doctor carried a bag of tools that looked like a torture kit. Knives, metal probes, cups for bloodletting, jars of leeches, and don't forget the classic urine wheel, a helpful chart that claimed your pee's color and smell could diagnose everything from gout to demonic possession. Spoiler, it usually just meant you were dehydrated. Meet Isidore, a respected physician in the city. He wears a velvet robe and reads Latin. Impressive. Right. Except his go-to cure for most ailments is either a purging, bleeding, or C, making you drink a mix of crushed pearls, vinegar, and powdered horn. He once accidentally bled a man for a headache and gave him a stroke. A shame, he said, that the balance of humors must be maintained. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine prolonged life or shortened it. Some treatments helped: herbal remedies, surgical drainage of infected wounds, even a few surprisingly advanced dental procedures. But others, terrifying. Trepanation, the act of drilling holes in your skull to release pressure. Burning feathers and stuffing them in your nose to cure sinus congestion. Drinking mercury for syphilis. People were desperate, and desperation is not the friend of reason. Let's not forget midwives and herbalists, most of whom were women, and many of whom knew more than the official doctors. They made poultices, brewed teas, and sometimes even washed their hands. But because they weren't university trained, they were often dismissed or accused of witchcraft, or both. And if your sickness didn't kill you, your treatment might. Bloodletting was so common it became the default prescription for just about everything. Weakness, bleed. Fever, bleed. Sadness, definitely bleed. By the end you were either cured or unconscious. Or, most likely dead. Now enter Maud, an old woman who swears by honey, garlic, and boiling everything. She hasn't been sick in years. She sleeps near the hearth, eats slowly, and refuses to shake hands with anyone. People call her strange. We call her the accidental founder of the immune system fan club. And if you really needed help, you prayed. You walked to the church, lit a candle, and begged your local saint to intervene. Some cities had specific saints for specific diseases, others just picked one and hoped for the best. Sometimes it worked, sometimes the saint had other plans. Plague pits. Let's talk about them. When disease swept through a city, the graveyards filled fast, too fast. So people were buried in mass graves, tens, hundreds, sometimes thousands, layered like lasagna. Monks chanted, bells tolled, rats celebrated, and the city carried on. Fringe detail. During one outbreak, a bishop ordered fresh flowers placed daily around the mass graves to cheer the dead. The flowers withered instantly, the smell did not. So you coughed, you bled, you shivered, and eventually, you either recovered stronger and with one fewer tooth, or you didn't. No one brought you soup. No one gave you sick days. Your bed didn't have sheets. Your medicine smelled like swamp water, and probably was. And yet people endured. Somehow, they died young. Yes, but they laughed between fevers, danced between outbreaks, and told stories while scratching rashes. They clung to life with dirty hands and brave hearts. Still want to time travel. Let's say you survive your illness. Barely. You're weak, half-starved, missing a few teeth, and possibly now allergic to sunlight. But you're alive. So what do? You go to work, because rest is a luxury. And in the medieval city, you work until you drop. There's no retirement, no weekends, no PTO, no concept of burnout. If you stop working, you stop eating, and you can only beg for so long before your neighbors start whispering, or worse, throwing spoiled cabbage. Let's meet Ivo. He's a cobbler's apprentice. He wakes before dawn, eats whatever's left of yesterday's porridge, scraped from the bottom of a clay pot, and heads into the workshop. There, he hammers, cuts, sews, and bleeds into shoes that he'll never afford to wear. He works until sundown, his fingers cracked and blackened from dye. Then, he limps home, where his only reward is not being whipped for being late. Most medieval city jobs were brutal. If you were lucky, you had a trade. Blacksmith, cooper, mason, tailor, tanner. If you were really lucky, you belonged to a guild. Guilds protected their members, trained apprentices, and made sure prices stayed fair. They were also strict, hierarchical, and sometimes corrupt. But they were better than nothing. And if you weren't in a guild, you were day labor, or street labor. You hauled bricks, cleaned cesspits, or carried water in sloshing buckets for a few pennies. You sold firewood, scraped fish guts, or begged. Some days, no work meant no food. Other days, it meant you took the worst job available and hoped you didn't lose a limb. Speaking of limbs, let's talk about safety. There wasn't any. Blacksmiths worked near open flames without gloves. Roofers fell off thatched cottages with no harnesses. Bakers inhaled flour dust until their lungs gave out. And tanners soaked hides in vats of lime and urine until their skin cracked and their bones ached. Quirky tidbit. Some tanners lost their fingerprints from constant chemical exposure. They couldn't be identified by touch. Centuries before fingerprints even mattered. Let's not forget, children. Childhood as we know it didn't exist. At 7 or 8, you were either apprenticed out or put to work helping the family. That meant carrying buckets, spinning wool, gutting fish, or begging on corners. Plate only if you count stick fighting other hungry kids behind the bakery. And women. They worked too. Always. They brewed ale, made candles, spun thread, sold eggs, baked bread, or took in laundry, all while raising children, cooking over open fires, and maybe, just maybe, sneaking off to midwife someone else's baby. Their labor was expected, undervalued, and unpaid. Let's meet Evelina, a widowed weaver. She makes woolen cloaks in a single smoky room, with 2 daughters and a blind grandmother. Her hands are so calloused they squeak when rubbed. Her income, just enough to buy barley and salt. If she misses a delivery deadline, the buyer threatens to go elsewhere. She begs for one more day. He shrugs. She works through the night. Historians still argue whether medieval urban workers were better off than rural peasants. Cities had more opportunity, more access to goods, more community, but they also had higher costs, more disease, more risk. And if you failed, there was no land to fall back on, just streets. There was no health insurance. If you got injured, lost a finger, broke a bone, you either healed or you didn't. Maybe someone gave you a poultice. Maybe you wrapped it in cloth and prayed, but you kept working, or you begged, or you died. That was the career ladder. And wages? Inconsistent. Prices changed with seasons, weather, and war. A good week meant bread and meat. A bad one meant you chewed on cabbage ends and drank vinegar water to feel full. Forget saving. You lived day to day. And if your tools broke, you pawned your shoes. Some tried to cheat the system. Fake injuries, stolen goods, counterfeit coins shaved so thin they snapped in half. But the punishment was swift. Stocks, whippings, or being tossed out of the guild for good. That meant social death. No work, no protection, just you and your increasingly empty stomach. Let's talk about those few who made it. The masters, the rich merchants, the ones with shops, apprentices, and spare cloaks. They worked too, but less, and they had others to risk their fingers, carry their bricks, take their beatings. Success existed, but it sat on top of a mountain of bruised bodies and snapped tendons. Fringe detail: some medieval cities passed laws limiting work hours. Paris tried to stop bakers from working at night. London considered banning early morning labor. No one listened. Bread doesn't bake itself, and children don't feed themselves either. So here you are, dragging your feet after 12 hours of hauling, pounding, stitching, or scrubbing. Your muscles ache, your skin itches from sweat and soot, and your stomach growls like a feral dog. You sit by the hearth, eat a crust of bread, maybe sip some small beer, and then you sleep, because you have to wake up and do it all again, until your hands stop working, until your back gives out, until someone younger takes your place and you fade into the background like the creak of the city's bones. No weekends, no retirement, just work, grind, and the slow erosion of your body until the dirt finally claims it. Let's say somehow you've managed to stay employed. Maybe you're an apprentice, a journeyman, or just a very determined candle dipper. That's great. Except now, your feet are bleeding, your armpits itch like they're hosting a flea renaissance, and your breath smells like something small died between your molars. Because in a medieval city, hygiene was a rumor, and shoes were a distant dream. We begin with your feet, because that's where most medieval people's health problems started and ended. Shoes weren't a guarantee, they were a privilege. Leather was expensive, cobblers were backlogged, and most people made do with wooden clogs, scraps of cloth, or just their own bare, cracked soles. You walked through sewage, blood, and vermin nests, with nothing but calluses and bad decisions. Meet Bryce, a tanner's son. He wears a single leather boot, left foot only, the right, wrapped in wool and prayer. He walks with a limp, not from injury, but from chronic trench foot. He says it doesn't hurt anymore. That's the problem. And if you were lucky enough to own actual shoes, they didn't help much. They got soaked in rain and other liquids. They rubbed blisters that turned into infections. They were repaired and handed down until they looked more like flaps of regret than footwear. You didn't take them off indoors, not because of etiquette, but because your feet were too swollen to get them back on. Now let's climb north to the armpits. Medieval clothes were made from wool, linen, or hemp. Good for warmth, terrible for breathing. Underclothes were a thing. Sort of. But changing them daily? Nope. Weekly? Maybe. If you were clean, people suspected you were either sick or vain. Soap existed, but it was harsh, lye-based, and expensive. Some made their own from animal fat and ash, but it stung like betrayal and left your skin feeling like dried bark. So most people washed occasionally, and only the parts that really needed it, usually hands. Maybe face, rarely anything south of the navel. Bathhouses did exist in some cities, communal, steamy, and surprisingly progressive. Men and women bathed together, at least early on, sometimes naked, sometimes in shifts. But bathhouses had reputations. The kind that involved whispered nicknames and suddenly missing spouses. Over time, they became associated with immorality and disease. By the late Middle Ages, most were closed, burned, or converted into prisons. Historians still argue whether medieval people really hated bathing, or just ran out of safe places to do it. Some believe the Black Death made people suspicious of water and open pores. Others say it was just logistics. Heating that much water took hours and a full forest's worth of firewood, easier to stink than to boil. Let's not forget your mouth. Dentistry wasn't a profession, it was a gamble. Teeth rotted, they fell out. Gums bled. Breath was a weapon. People tried to clean their teeth using cloth, salt, ash, or twigs. The results? Inconclusive. Cavities were common. Jaw infections too. If a tooth hurt, you yanked it out with pliers and something to bite down on, or someone else held you while you screamed. Fringe detail. Some medieval physicians believed tooth pain came from tiny toothworms living inside your molars. No joke, they'd try to smoke them out with burnt herbs. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it did make your mouth smell like sage and despair. Now meet Cecily, a washerwoman with 7 surviving children and a permanent scowl. She bathes twice a year, Easter and harvest time. She uses cold water, a rag, and prayers whispered through gritted teeth. Her neighbors think she's obsessive, but her kids haven't had lice in weeks, and that's practically a miracle. Speaking of lice, everyone had them. In your hair, your clothes, your bedding, you scratched constantly. You picked through seams, combed your children's scalps with blunt knives, and burned what couldn't be salvaged. Lice weren't shameful, they were inevitable. Same for fleas, same for bedbugs. You weren't trying to be clean, you were just trying not to itch yourself to death. To help with the smell, people carried parmanders, little metal balls filled with herbs, cloves, or sponges soaked in vinegar. Others wore sprigs of rosemary or lavender in their hats. Some dabbed rosewater behind their ears. Perfume was expensive, but even a whiff of mint oil could spare you the worst of the city's collective stench. And what about laundry? It was done near rivers or communal wash areas, labor-intensive, cold, and back-breaking. Clothes were scrubbed with lye, beaten against rocks, wrung out by hand, and hung over bushes. Whites turned brown, wool shrank. Everything smelled like smoke and old soap. You didn't wash things because they were dirty, you washed them because they stopped functioning as clothes. And let's not forget the final frontier of medieval hygiene. Your hands. No sanitizer. No soap by the door. People wiped noses on sleeves, sneezed freely, shook hands after gutting animals, and then ate with their fingers. There were spoons and knives. Yes, but if you wanted to be fast, you used the same fingers that had just chased lice out of your shirt collar. You'd think people would notice the connection between filth and disease. Some did. Monks were cleaner than most. Physicians wrote about personal regimen. Wealthy merchants built private baths. But the average person didn't have time, didn't have money, didn't have soap. So you lived itchy, smelly, blistered. You layered your stink with your neighbors, and together, you created the symphony of the city. And that, my friend, is why in the medieval city, you stank, and so did everyone else. Let's say you've adjusted to the smell. Not because it got better. Oh no, it absolutely didn't. You just gave up. Your nose surrendered. But then you hear something strange. A cheer, a drumbeat, and people running toward the square. You follow, curious. Maybe there's a festival. A parade, something joyful, finally. Nope, it's a public execution. Welcome to medieval city entertainment. You push through the crowd, people are smiling, jostling for a good view. Children sit on their father's shoulders. Vendors sell hot chestnuts and stale pastries. In the center stands a raised wooden scaffold. Ropes hang. An executioner sharpens his axe. A man in chains sobs quietly as a priest murmurs a prayer beside him. This isn't a rare event, it's a Tuesday. Executions were public by design. They weren't just punishments, they were theater. The authorities wanted you to see, to watch, to learn. They wanted fear baked into your morning routine. Let's meet Lambert, a man convicted of stealing from the church. He didn't take much, just a silver candlestick and half a loaf of sacramental bread. But the church wanted an example made. So here he stands, barefoot, shaking, accused of both theft and sacrilege. The sentence: hanging. A bell rings. The crowd goes silent. And then, someone throws a cabbage. Executions drew everyone, not just for the spectacle, but for the message. This is what happens when you step out of line. And if it was a burning, oh boy, that brought out half the city. People climbed walls for a better view. They brought food, made jokes, cheered, some even danced. Historians still argue whether these public punishments were truly effective deterrents or just medieval reality TV. But they were undeniably popular. The city square became a stage. The condemned, actors in a show they didn't audition for. And it wasn't just hangings or burnings. There were beheadings, brandings, whippings, and the infamous pillory, a wooden frame that locked your head and hands in place. You were displayed like a sad, angry fruit basket, while people threw vegetables, insults, or worse. Let's meet Joan, a baker accused of selling underweight loaves. Her punishment: 2 hours in the pillory and a public flogging. She's pelted with old onions, called flour thief, and spit on by a man who still owes her money. She survives, but her shop never reopens. And then there's the wheel. Not every city used it, but when they did, terrifying. The victims' limbs were shattered with a hammer, and their body tied to a wheel like a grotesque sculpture. It was slow, painful, intended to shock. People watched, not with horror, but with morbid fascination. Let's not forget quartering, where criminals were tied to horses and pulled apart, or drawing and hanging, where death took its sweet time. Executioners were supposed to be professionals, but they were human. They missed, they slipped. Sometimes they had a grudge, sometimes they were drunk. And when the axe didn't land clean, the crowd groaned, or laughed. Quirky tidbit: in London, execution days were often delayed if the weather was bad. No one wanted to hang someone in the rain. It ruined the turnout. Justice apparently preferred clear skies. Children attended these events as lessons. Look, Thomas, that's what happens to liars. Some played executioner games afterward, swinging sticks and pretending to chop off heads. Little medieval fun for the whole family. And if you were rich or well-connected, you got a private execution, or just a fine, or nothing at all. The punishment wasn't about the crime, it was about your social standing. A poor man who stole bread could be hanged, a noble who stole land. Given a title and a feast. But let's talk about the psychological toll. People grew numb. The first hanging you see makes you cry. The 5th, you bring snacks. The 30th, you're just annoyed someone blocked your view. Death became routine, and routine became a kind of moral erosion. Even clergy weren't spared. Heretics were burned. Witches were drowned. Anyone who challenged the status quo found themselves in the town square, looking up at the birds, one last time. And then there were the executioners themselves. Feared, hated, necessary. They lived on the edge of society, paid by the job, barred from churches, avoided at market. Some wore hoods to protect their identities. Others didn't care. One executioner in Prague was known for singing before each sentence. The crowd loved him. He even had a catchphrase: "Let's make it clean." Fringe detail: some cities buried executioners in special cemeteries alone, as if the stink of death followed them into the afterlife. So when you see a crowd gathering in the square, think twice before joining. You might be watching justice, or just medieval theater, with a very final curtain. And if you ever wondered how a society learns to laugh at pain, just spend a few days in the medieval city's public square. By now, you've accepted that your city smells like regret, your job is slow-motion disintegration, and public executions are the closest thing to Netflix. But there's one more daily gamble you haven't considered: the bread. Because in a medieval city, bread wasn't just food. It was survival. It was currency. It was occasionally your doom. Let's talk about the bakeries. Flour was ground at local mills, often monopolized by the nobility, who taxed the grinding process so heavily you'd swear they were charging by the sneeze. Bakers bought it in bulk, mixed it with water, yeast if available, and maybe a bit of leftover grit from the floor. And if times were hard, they got creative. Sawdust, chalk, clay, crushed beans, sand. All of these found their way into bread as extenders, cheap, tasteless fillers that bulked up a loaf and helped stretch the flour. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it cracked your molar. Let's meet Bertrand, a skinny baker with one eyebrow and an aggressive hunch. He's known for his bread's extra texture. His neighbors suspect it's because he bakes in a soot-stained oven, filled with rat footprints and cobwebs. Bertrand swears its flavor. He also swears a lot when people complain about crunching something that fights back. Most people bought black bread, a coarse rye-based loaf, full of husks and imperfections. Only the rich ate white bread, finely sifted and soft. It was a symbol of status, purity, and digestive ease. The rest of the city, they ate brick. And it wasn't just a matter of texture, it was health. Spoiled grain could host ergot, a fungus that when ingested caused hallucinations, seizures, and even death. Symptoms included burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, and paranoid ranting. In some villages, entire families were affected. Locals thought they were possessed. In reality, they just had a bad baguette. Historians still argue whether certain witchcraft outbreaks were actually mass ergot poisoning. Entire towns danced in the streets, raving and screaming. Some accused their neighbors of sorcery, others saw demons in their stew, all because their bread was spiked by nature's most ironic prank. And there were rules. Technically, cities passed ordinances regulating the size and weight of loaves. Bakers who shorted customers were punished. Some were put in the stocks, others had their bread confiscated and publicly burned. One unfortunate soul in York was forced to parade through town, wearing a chain of stale loaves like a necklace of shame. Still, cheating happened constantly. Grain was expensive. Firewood was scarce. If a baker burned a batch, he didn't toss it. He scraped off the blackened crust and sold it as roasted rye. If rats chewed a sack of flour, he just picked out the visible droppings. A little dirt never hurt anyone, until it did. And let's not forget the bread riots. When grain prices soared after a bad harvest, a war, or just noble hoarding, the people revolted. Bread was life, and when life was denied, fists flew, markets were raided, bakeries smashed, millers chased into rivers. One woman in Rouen reportedly led a mob with a rolling pin, shouting "No more crumbs," like a war cry. Enter Edith, a widow, who sells rolls from a wooden cart. She wakes before dawn, kneads in the cold, with hands that crack and bleed, and sells to whoever gets there first. When flour runs out, she makes air bread, just crust, folded and fluffed. Her customers know, they buy it anyway. They smile with broken teeth. And if you were too poor to buy bread, you begged, or stole, or got charity loaves from the church. Usually, the scraps from communion or donations baked from questionable leftovers. Moldy, yes. Nutritious, not really. Life-saving, possibly. Fringe detail: some cities had bread clocks, metal discs with holes to measure a loaf's proper size. Inspectors would test a baker's goods by passing the loaf through the ring. If it didn't fit, they fined him. If it crumbled, they fined him more. If it screamed, that's a whole other problem. Bread wasn't just food, it was politics. Nobles controlled the grain. The church blessed it. Bakers feared it. And you? You just hoped it wouldn't poison you. You gnawed it slowly, sipped thin ale, and prayed the lump in your gut was just hunger, not hallucinations waiting to start. And yet, you needed it. Every day, every meal, A slab of black bread with garlic, a crust dipped in thin stew, a roll stuffed with fish paste. It was disgusting. It was holy. It was everything. Because in a city where your job could maim you, your roof could fall on you, and your neighbors might mistake you for a thief, bread was the one constant, even when it tried to kill you. So maybe the bread didn't kill you. Yet, you're alive, you're chewing, and you're vaguely full, which means it's time to think about your future, specifically getting married, or rather, being married off. Because in a medieval city, marriage was not about love, it was about survival, status, and sometimes just staying out of the workhouse. Romance novels hadn't been invented, neither had teenage independence. Marriage wasn't a personal journey, it was a transaction. Your parents chose your partner. If you were lucky, they chose someone local, employed, and only mildly smelly. If not, too bad. Love was a luxury, and you couldn't afford it. Let's meet Adela, a 14-year-old girl with a crooked smile and an older sister already buried behind the church. Her father owes money to a spice merchant. That merchant has a 30-year-old son with 2 functioning eyes and a decent shop. The match is made. Adela becomes a wife before she even understands what it means. She nods. She doesn't cry, she just adds another layer to her apron and prays her husband doesn't snore. This wasn't rare. Marrying young was common. Girls were wed as early as 12 or 13. Boys, usually a bit older, 15 to 20, if they could afford it. Marriage required resources, a place to live, tools for a trade, maybe a goat. Without that, you were just another mouth in an already overstuffed tenement. And for women, marriage was often the only option. You either married, joined a convent, or hoped someone rich died and left you an inheritance. If none of those worked out, you became a washerwoman, or were. Historians still debate how much choice medieval women had in marriage. Some argue that parental pressure was absolute. Others point to court records showing couples eloping, sneaking kisses in back alleys, or making their own matches, at least occasionally. But overall, choice was a sliding scale, a slippery, dung-coated slope of obligation. Weddings themselves weren't glamorous. No white gowns, no orchestras, often no priest. A valid marriage could be declared with just a spoken vow in front of witnesses. No cake, no dance, just, "I take you," and a handshake. If a priest showed up later, that was a bonus. Let's meet Ulrich, a 20-year-old apprentice brewer who marries his neighbor Beatrix outside the tavern at dusk. They exchange simple words, split a meat pie, and go home to a room behind his master's shop. That's it. No rings, no witnesses, but the guy who sells fish heads. Still counts. And after marriage, children. Quickly. Contraception existed, but poorly. Some used herbs, barriers, or strategic abstinence. Others just crossed their fingers and hoped. Pregnancy was expected. Frequent. Dangerous. Fringe fact. Some midwives recommended women eat cold cabbage after intercourse to cool the womb. Others swore by jumping up and down, and if that didn't work, 9 months later, you met mortality head-on. Childbirth was brutal. No hospitals, no sanitation, just a dark room, boiling water, and whoever could be spared to help. Women gave birth kneeling, squatting, or gripping ropes from the ceiling. No epidurals, no antiseptics, just moaning, blood, and fate. If you survived, you might name the child after the nearest saint. If not, the midwife prayed and moved on. Let's meet Agnes, who's given birth 7 times. 4 children survived, 2 now work as apprentices, 1 just learned to walk. She's 29 and walks like she's 80. Her hands are raw from laundry, her back bent from years of carrying wood and babies. She doesn't complain, she just ties another scarf over her hair and says, "At least my husband hasn't died of the cough." Marriage wasn't a fairy tale, it was a working arrangement. You shared food, chores, and whatever coins trickled in. You bickered over firewood, clashed over which saint's day to observe, and whispered through thin walls, while rats danced in the corners. And if one of you died, and you probably would, you remarried. Quickly. Mourning was a luxury, survival didn't wait. And abuse? It happened. Often, husbands hit wives, wives hit back, neighbors heard, and mostly stayed silent. Unless it got loud, then someone might call for the city beadle, who'd show up, grunt, and walk away. There were rules, technically, but enforcement was rare, especially if the man had a job and the woman had no family nearby. And yet, not all was grim. Some couples found companionship, even joy. They laughed, sang, raised children who made it past 5. They shared bread and stories, patched each other's clothes, and sat quietly together at dusk. In a world full of chaos, that counted as paradise. So don't think of medieval marriage as a love story. Think of it as a survival pact. 2 people tying themselves to each other in hopes they wouldn't drown alone. You didn't marry for fireworks. You married for firewood, for safety, for the hope that tonight the rats might choose someone else's pillow for once. By now you've got a spouse you didn't choose, bread you don't trust, and a persistent itch you've just started calling Gregory out of familiarity. But even if you somehow keep your head down, your job steady, and your family intact, there's still one force that hovers over everything you do: the church. Because in the medieval city, religion wasn't a part of life, it was life. Your thoughts, your actions, your calendar, your fears, your hopes, all filtered through stained glass and incense smoke. Let's meet Father Odo. He runs the parish down the street, and you hear his bells every morning, every feast day, and every time someone dies. Odo's got a booming voice, a back bent from reading too many scrolls, and a tolerance for sin that depends entirely on who's confessing. He's your priest, your judge, your therapist, your town crier, and in a pinch, your landlord. Church bells are your clock. You don't have a watch. You have matins, lauds, prime, tersax, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Don't know what time it is, just count how many times you've been guilted since sunrise. Mass is mandatory. Attendance isn't tracked, but everyone knows who skips. And if you do, you can expect whispers, side eyes, and possibly a surprise sermon about those who stray from the flock. You go, you kneel, you nod, you mouth Latin words you don't understand, and hope your posture hides your hangover. The church decides what's holy, what's sinful, and what's probably demonic. And trust me, the list of demonic things is long. Dancing too much, laughing during Lent, eating meat on Fridays, brewing beer without a priest's blessing, swearing, sneezing without saying God bless me, and reading certain books, especially if you can read at all. Historians still argue how deeply faith permeated the medieval psyche. Some believe people were fanatically devout, living in constant fear of hellfire. Others say faith was more practical, performative, even a tool for social order rather than personal belief. But one thing's certain, the church was everywhere, always. It owned land, lots of it. It collected tithes, 10% of whatever you earned, grew or scrounged. No coin? No problem. They'd take your grain, your eggs, your chickens, your wine, your labor. Salvation, it turns out, had a price tag. Let's meet Isabeau, a widow who owes back tithes and has only a goat to her name. The priest visits. She offers cheese. He frowns, takes the goat, and tells her to pray harder. That night, she kneels by a candle and asks the Virgin Mary to give the goat back. No response. The church also governed education. Most schools were run by clergy. If you learned to write, to count, to read, thank a monk or curse him, depending on how many times he whacked your knuckles with a stick that week. But for most people, illiteracy. The Bible was a distant, mysterious book in Latin. Your understanding of scripture came through paintings, stained glass, and sermons shouted by men who hadn't bathed since Pentecost. Confession was routine. You entered a wooden booth, whispered your worst thoughts, and hoped the priest didn't gasp. Sins ranged from theft to impure thoughts, which included everything from dreams to long glances. Penance varied: prayers, fasting, maybe a pilgrimage, if you were especially bad or unlucky. And sin was everywhere. Natural disasters, God's punishment, failed crops, you sinned, sick child, sin, stub your toe on the way to market, God is testing you. And the devil? He's always nearby. In your neighbor's smirk, in your dreams, possibly in your bread. Quirky detail: some churches kept lists of sinful smells. If your home stank too much, they assumed demonic influence. One parish accused a butcher of harboring evil spirits because his meat hooks kept swinging on their own. Turns out it was just rats. Holidays were constant. Saints' days, feasts, processions. These were your breaks from labor, but also required more devotion. You dressed up, walked in parades, kissed relics, pieces of bone, wood or cloth, allegedly tied to holy figures, and stood through sermons that made your knees weep. And heaven help you if you were excommunicated.
That meant social death.
No sacraments, no burial, in consecrated ground. People crossed the street to avoid you. If you died, your body was dumped outside the cemetery walls, sometimes face down, just to be safe. Let's meet Hugo, who insulted a bishop's mule. He was excommunicated for blasphemy against consecrated transport. For 3 weeks no one spoke to him. His bread went moldy. His chickens stopped laying. Finally, he bought a candle the size of his arm, donated it to the church, and begged forgiveness. He was reinstated. The mule remained unimpressed. And then there were the inquisitors. Rare but terrifying. Sent to root out heresy. They wore robes, carried books, and asked questions no right answer could survive. Accused of heresy? Good luck. Trials were public. Outcomes were grim. You might confess under pressure, then get executed anyway, just to be sure. Yet, despite all this, people found comfort in faith. They believed in divine justice, heavenly rewards, and the mercy of saints. They lit candles for lost children, prayed over ailing parents, whispered Ave Marias in the dark. Faith was a lifeline in a city that offered precious few. So you cross yourself. You mutter your prayers. You kiss the bishop's ring even though it smells like fish. You fear hell. You fear the priest. But mostly you fear being noticed. Because in a world governed by incense and judgment, invisibility is the closest thing to peace. And if you're lucky, maybe God isn't looking too closely this week. So now you've given the church its due. You've confessed your sins, lit your candle, and dodged excommunication for another week. All good? Not quite. Because if you think divine judgment is harsh, wait until you meet Mother Nature. Living in a medieval city meant living at the mercy of fires, floods, and famines. Often in the same season, these weren't inconveniences. These were announcements that your life could unravel faster than a loose thread in your only shirt. Let's begin with fire. We've touched on it before, but here's the full horror show. Your house is made of wood. Your roof, thatched. Your lighting, candles. Your neighbors, just as flammable as you. Fires didn't spread. They exploded. One gust of wind, and the whole block was roasting like a heretic on feast day. Meet Alditha, a washerwoman who leaves a candle burning while boiling laundry. The wind picks up. The curtain flutters. 37 homes are gone by dawn. The city blames her. She's fined 5 pence and loses everything. Her husband mutters that maybe God was punishing them. She doesn't disagree. There were no fire departments. If a fire started, you shouted, ran for water, and hoped the bucket chain didn't trip over a goat. Some cities had fire watchers, but they were underpaid and mostly drunk. People kept sand buckets in their homes, one of the earliest safety measures, but they rarely helped. Once a fire started, it was basically over. And then came floods. Medieval cities weren't exactly known for their stellar drainage systems. Many were built near rivers, for trade, for water access, for some illusion of natural defense. But those rivers had moods. They rose quickly, spilled over stone walls, and turned entire neighborhoods into stew pots of raw sewage and sadness. Let's meet Ermenard, a butcher whose shop is down near the docks. Every spring the river rises. His basement floods. His barrels of salted meat float like bloated corpses. He swears, bails water, and considers moving. He never does. No one ever does. The city is their prison, and their only chance of survival. Floods didn't just ruin property. They spread disease. Cesspits overflowed. Human waste, mixed with animal waste, mixed with decomposing vegetables. Rats threw parties. Children got sick. Waterlogged grain sprouted mold. Everyone got dysentery. Again, historians still argue how much of medieval health crises were sparked by flood conditions alone. Some estimate that flood-triggered illnesses killed more than famine. Others believe the real killer was the combination of floods weakening immune systems, which then couldn't fight off diseases already stewing in the population. And then, oh yes, famine. The slow creeping horror of empty fields and tighter belts. Crops failed constantly. Too much rain, ruined. Too little rain, also ruined. A late frost, a hailstorm, a swarm of pests, or a sudden cold snap could turn a promising harvest into a tragic joke. And guess what? Most people didn't store enough food. Why would they? They lived day to day. Let's meet Tib, a poor widow with 3 children and 1 bag of oats. When the grain shipment doesn't arrive and the miller raises prices, she waters down oat porridge until it's closer to oat memory. Her children whimper at night. She stares at the wall. Her neighbor collapses while carrying firewood. Tib tells her children that God is testing them. She doesn't believe it. City authorities tried to respond. Sometimes they created grain reserves. They opened church pantries. But those ran out fast. Riots followed. Bakeries were stormed. Bread carts overturned. People fought over moldy loaves with fingernails and teeth. A baker in Norwich was once beaten with his own bread peel for refusing to lower prices. Fringe detail: in one famine year, people in France reportedly made bread from powdered bark. It tasted like sadness and tree. Some survived, others didn't. The line between innovation and desperation was razor thin, and usually moldy. And then there was winter. Not charming, not cozy, cruel. Homes had no insulation. Fires were small. Blankets were few. Water froze in buckets. Toes turned blue. Rats came inside for warmth. You wore every piece of clothing you owned, and still shivered through the night. Entire families slept in a pile like puppies. If someone died in their sleep, you didn't even notice until morning. That's how still they already were. And summer. Not much better. Heat brought rot. It bloated meat, soured ale, and filled the air with the smell of bad decisions. Insects swarmed. Wounds festered. People fainted. Fires sparked more easily. Tempers rose. And when the sun finally set, the sweat didn't stop. Let's meet Lambert, a corper who once passed out during a heat wave and fell face first into his own barrel. His wife found him stuck, legs kicking, swearing in Latin. She couldn't get him out until morning. He lived. But he walked funny afterward. Weather didn't care who you were. Nobles died in floods. Priests starved during famines. Fires ate mansions and shacks alike. The rich rebuilt faster, but no one was safe. No one ever felt truly secure. There were no weather forecasts, only rumors, aching knees, and livestock acting weird. And when disaster struck, people didn't blame nature, they blamed sin. Someone angered God. Someone spoke during Mass. Someone bathed on a feast day. Punishment, always. And when they couldn't find a reason, they picked a scapegoat, a foreigner, a widow, a woman with a birthmark. So each day you rose, looked at the sky, and wondered, is today the day it all falls apart? Because in a medieval city, the elements weren't just outside, they lived with you. In your rafters, in your bread, in your bones. And you prayed for mild weather and weaker winds. You prayed for just one season that didn't try to kill you. You rarely got it. You've survived the flood, the frost, and the flaming house down the lane. Your shoes are soggy, your bread's gone green, and your neighbor's goat looks at you with barely veiled judgment. But now comes the one threat you really can't afford, a legal dispute. Because in a medieval city, you didn't get justice, you got hierarchy. And the higher up someone was, the more likely you were to lose. Let's begin with how it worked. There wasn't one tidy court system. There were multiple overlapping ones. The Lord's Court, the Bishop's Court, the Merchant's Court, the King's Court, and good luck figuring out which one you belonged to. Most people just ended up at the local manorial or borough court, where the judge was often your neighbor, your tax collector, or the cousin of the guy you were arguing against. Let's meet Athelard, A cooper who claims his neighbor Elwin stole a pig. Elwin says the pig wandered over on its own and changed loyalty. Athelard takes it to court. The judge, Elwin's landlord. The verdict, Elwin keeps the pig. Athelard is fined for wasting court time. Theft, debt, slander, broken contracts, land disputes, marital squabbles. These all ended up in these dusty little courtrooms, or open-air benches where robed men squinted over parchment while chickens wandered through the proceedings. But justice wasn't blind. It wore coin-colored glasses. If you had money, you could hire an advocate, essentially a talkative guy with better shoes and an understanding of Latin. If you didn't, you represented yourself badly. And if you were a woman, good luck. You couldn't testify against a man unless someone backed you. If no one did, too bad. The law assumed you were confused, hysterical, or both. Historians still argue whether these courts were sincerely trying to be fair or simply tools of enforcement for the wealthy. Some records show surprising equity, peasants winning against corrupt bailiffs. Others show nobles steamrolling over entire communities. The truth, as usual, lies in the middle, but usually beneath someone richer. And let's talk about evidence. There weren't fingerprints or forensics. There were oaths, witnesses, and trial by ordeal if things got spicy. Accused of theft, you might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces. If your wounds healed clean in 3 days, you were innocent. If they festered, you were guilty. God was the ultimate judge, and he apparently had strong feelings about infection rates. Quirky tidbit. Some towns used ordeal by cold water. They tied a rope around your waist and dropped you into a pond. If you sank, you were innocent, but maybe drowned. If you floated, you were guilty, because water, being pure, rejected liars. Either way, you got wet, possibly dead. And let's not forget fines. Everything came with a fine. In this church? Fine. Argue in public? Fine. Let your pig wander unsupervised? Fine. And the money often went to the local lord or court official. Justice wasn't just blind, it was profitable. Enter Gudrun, a widow, wrongly accused of overcharging for her ale. She doesn't read, she doesn't speak Latin, she shows up to court in her only gown, holding the measuring cup she always uses. The court inspects it, declares it slightly too generous. Verdict, guilty. Her fine is 3 days' earnings. She pays, she cries, she keeps serving ale, she doesn't forget. Then there was compurgation. You gathered a group of neighbors, usually 12, and they swore you were honest, not because they had evidence, just because they believed you. This was medieval Yelp, and your reputation was the only thing standing between you and a beating. But if you had enemies, or if the community just didn't like your face, you couldn't find 12 people to vouch for you. You were on your own. And if you lost a case and couldn't pay your fine, you were jailed, or your property seized, or your goods auctioned, or, in some rare cases, you were put in the pillory. Not for the crime, but for being too poor to pay for it. And what about appeals? Forget it. Most courts were final. And if you did appeal, it cost money you didn't have, plus travel, time off work, and more Latin than your skull could handle. Let's meet Wulfric, a dyer whose neighbor dumped ashes into his dye barrel. He files a complaint. The judge listens. The neighbor denies. The judge shrugs. Wulfric is told to forgive in Christian spirit. He goes home and burns the neighbor's laundry. This time, he's fined. Justice. Fringe detail. Some lords held court only twice a year. So if you had a pressing complaint in July, you might wait until December to speak your piece. By then, the pig was dead, the land was gone, or your opponent had mysteriously disappeared, suspiciously near the river with rocks in his pockets. So you learned quickly, don't rely on the courts. Settle things privately, make deals, use threats, trade favors, marry someone's cousin, bribe a scribe, bake in extra pie for the reeve. Because actual justice, that was rare. You didn't go to court for fairness. You went to court to be reminded who actually ran things. Let's say you're lucky. You've never been fined for walking too fast. Your pig hasn't testified against you, and your neighbor hasn't sued you over a shared fence that technically doesn't exist. But just when you start thinking the worst is over, you round the corner and see it, a corpse, just lying there. Because in a medieval city, death was casual, public, and everywhere. People died all the time at home, in the streets, in taverns, in churches, while eating, while praying, sometimes while arguing about bread prices. Life expectancy hovered somewhere between don't make any plans and surprise. You could drop dead of an infected splinter, a cough that got mean, or a bad bowl of stew, and no one would even flinch. Let's meet Edric, a weaver with a mild cough and a plan to finish 3 tunics by Sunday. He collapses mid-stitch on Thursday afternoon. His apprentice kicks his boot, realizes he's not getting up, and mutters, "Well, that's that." He drags Edric's body out to the alley. Someone covers it with a cloth. Later that night, a group of boys pokes it with a stick. By morning, it's gone. No, not taken by angels. Taken by the body cart. Cities employed corpse collectors, usually men with strong stomachs and no sense of smell. They made their rounds daily, more often during plague outbreaks, hauling the dead to mass graves outside city walls. No ceremony, no prayers, just a shallow trench, quicklime and a quick cover-up. On good days, they even buried the right body. Bodies left too long were a hazard, not because of ghosts or curses, though people definitely worried about those, but because of smell, disease, and rats. And yes, sometimes bodies were burned, but firewood was expensive. Burial was cheaper. Graveyards overflowed. Literally, during mass death events like famine or plague, bodies were stacked like firewood. Graves were reused, bones resurfaced, dogs dug, children played too close, people whispered that the saints were weeping. In truth, the soil just wasn't deep enough. Historians still argue how common it was for medieval cities to have proper burial protocols. Some claim urban parishes were organized and respectful. Others cite archaeological digs, where skeletons are crammed into layers like lasagna. It depended on the time, the place, and how many people had died that week. Let's meet one Flade, a gravedigger who's buried more people than she can remember. Her back is hunched, her hands calloused, and her eyes don't blink much anymore. She doesn't ask names. She doesn't ask how. She just digs, prays, and keeps an extra spade for when the earth collapses. If you were rich, you got buried inside the church, or beneath it. Not great for air quality, but very fashionable. The poor, in the yard if space allowed. If not, outside the city. If even that wasn't available, you were moved. Quietly, sometimes without your family knowing. And then there were the plague pits. Deep, wide, rushed, entire families dumped in together. One cart, 20 bodies, no markers. It was survival, not ritual. No one had time to mourn. No one could afford to pause. Let's not forget how death notices worked. There were no obituaries, no funeral announcements. If someone important died, the church rang the bells. If someone you knew died, you found out when they didn't show up for bread, or work, or morning prayer. Sometimes you'd find out too late. You'd call their name across the street, only to have someone mutter, "He's gone." You'd nod. No one asked how, because the answer was almost always the same: sickness, starvation, or accident. Fringe detail? In some places, the bodies of executed criminals were displayed on spikes or hanging in cages, a reminder to the living. The crows loved it. So did the children. It became a game. How long would the head last before the birds got it? The answer, not long. Death didn't wait for your plans. It didn't care about your harvest or your baby's first steps. One day you were buying onions. The next, your shoes were in a pile outside the charnel house. No last words, no poetic exit, just silence, or screaming, or both. And despite all this, people kept going. They mourned, yes, but fast. They said prayers. They lit candles. They threw dirt and whispered names. But then they moved on, because they had to. The bread still needed baking. The well still needed cleaning. And your neighbor's goat still needed kicking. In a world where life was fragile and death was familiar, people learned to hold joy and grief in the same palm. A wedding might follow a funeral. A birth might come days after a sibling's burial. Laughter echoed through the same alleys, where bodies had just been dragged. You didn't dwell, you endured. So the next time someone vanishes from the market, or fails to show up to confession, you don't panic, you don't even ask questions. You just tighten your belt, keep walking, and avoid the cart with the sheet over it. You keep walking, past the cart with the sheet, past the children poking it with sticks, past the dog sniffing it like it knows something you don't want to. Because in the medieval city, night is coming. And when night falls, so does the curtain on comfort. There's no electricity, no moonlight, strong enough to guide your path. Just darkness, thick, total, alive. It leaks into your bones, crawls up the back of your neck, and whispers one eternal truth. You are not safe. Streets were never lit. Most cities didn't bother. A few had oil lamps near main squares or churches, but those were rare, expensive, and often stolen for the copper. The rest of the city, pure blackout. Imagine your darkest nightmare. Now add rats, wet cobblestones, and a drunk man vomiting from a second-story window. That's your walk home. Let's meet Odalina, a spinner with bad knees and worse timing. She's coming home late from delivering thread. Her path, a twisting maze of alleys that reek of rotting cabbage, spoiled ale, and the kind of decisions you don't tell the priest about. She clutches her bundle tight, listens for footsteps, and hopes tonight isn't the night she becomes a chalk outline in someone's memory. And the people who own the night. Not you, criminals, drunkards, jealous husbands, armed mercenaries between jobs. They prowl the streets with confidence and clanking boots. There's no police force, no whistles, no help. Maybe you hear the night watchman dragging his feet, mumbling half-sober warnings about curfew and sin. His lantern's almost out. He has a stick. That's it. If you scream, he might help, or he might run, or he might just say a prayer and keep walking. Historians still argue whether these night watch patrols actually stopped crime or just served as a medieval version of security theater. The answer, judging from crime rates and the number of murderers who simply fled to the next town, is not very effective. And even if no human bothers you, the streets themselves might. They're uneven, slick with, well, everything, and full of hidden dangers. A broken ankle means infection. Infection means fever. Fever means you're about to become a footnote in your own life. You can't see the rats, but they see you. You can't see the puddles, but your foot finds them. And heaven help you if someone opens a chamber pot above you. Let's not forget animals. Dogs. Not the friendly kind. Half-wild mutts roam the streets at night, scavenging, howling, sometimes snapping at anything that moves. Packs of them. Territorial. Starving. They weren't pets. They were problems with teeth. And the air. It turns colder, wetter. It clings to your clothes, seeps into your bones, and smells like someone boiled moldy bread in a sewer. Because they probably did. So you hurry home, assuming you have one. Maybe you share a bed with 3 people. Maybe it's a room above a tannery. Maybe your door locks. Maybe it doesn't. You slide the bolt, stuff a cloth at the base to block the wind, and sit in the dark. Because candles are expensive, and you need them to last the week. You don't have much to entertain you. No books, you're illiterate. No instruments, your last lute string snapped during a fight. No board games, unless you count watching your lice race across your sleeve. So you talk, or listen, or stare at the wall and try not to think about death carts or the noise you swear came from the alley. Then someone coughs, long, hacking, deep. You freeze. You know that sound. Everyone does. It might be nothing. It might be the beginning. Because night doesn't just bring crime or cold. It brings plague. And the first symptom is always a cough. Let's meet Lambert, your neighbor. He coughed like that last week. Then his neck swelled. Then he bled from his gums. Now his door is shut, marked with a red X. No one goes in. No one asks. They just throw food through the window and hope the rats don't get it first. And you? You lie in the dark, trying to ignore your own breathing, praying you don't hear a cart tomorrow morning with one too many bumps on it. Fringe fact, some cities tried curfews. If you were caught outside after sunset without a reason, you were fined or imprisoned. Of course, that depended on who you were. Merchants bribed their way through. Nobles ignored the rule entirely. You stayed inside, or ran. But even indoors you weren't safe. Fires started. Roofs collapsed. Ceilings dripped something unholy. Insects swarmed. You wrapped yourself in wool, tucked your feet under the least damp corner of your straw mattress, and whispered prayers to saints who might not be listening anymore. And just before sleep, if it comes, you listen. For footsteps. For coughs. For creaking beams. For the wind pushing something heavy down the street. In the medieval city, night didn't fall. It arrived. With teeth. With claws. With no interest in your well-being. And you? You lay still, eyes wide, waiting for the sun to rise, and pretending you don't hear the scratching behind the wall. You wake up, you're still alive. The house didn't burn, the cough didn't spread, and the scratching behind the wall didn't turn into something that chews. Victory. Sort of. But now you've got to face something far worse than death. Disease. Or your neighbor's snoring goat. You've got to face taxes. Because in a medieval city, every breath you took had a price tag. Let's start with the tithes. We've already talked about them, but just to recap, the church expects 10% of everything. Your income, your harvest, your animals, your ale. If it exists, they want a cut. They say it's for God. It's actually for the bishop's new vestments and another silver incense bowl. Next, the Lord's tax. Because you don't own your house, or your shop, or your land. You lease it from a noble who might not even live in the city, who sends his steward twice a year to collect what's rightfully his. You pay in coin, in goods, or in chickens. The steward prefers chickens. They cluck louder than complaints. Then there's the guild fee. If you're in a trade, bakers, smiths, dyers, weavers, they all have guilds. The guild protects you, sure, but it also bleeds you. Monthly dues, event fees, bribes, and the occasional gift for the guildmaster's birthday. Don't pay, you're out. No license, no work, no dinner. Let's meet Azana, a seamstress, who missed one guild payment when her loom cracked. They fined her double. When she couldn't pay, they locked her stall. She cried. They didn't. Her apprentice had to sneak thread through the window just so Azana could finish a noble's underpants order. It's not glamorous, but unpaid underwear is still a crime. And then comes the market tax. You want to sell your wares in the public square? You pay a stall fee. You want a stall closer to the main road? That's extra. You want shade? More. Want to set up next to the guy who sells fish heads? Free, but you'll regret it. Historians still argue how oppressive these overlapping tax systems were. Some cities were considered lenient, offering tax holidays during famines. Others squeezed every penny until riots broke out. Either way, no one walked through life untaxed. If you didn't pay in coin, you paid in sweat. And now, the toll tax. Want to bring your goods into the city? You pay at the gate. Want to leave with a cart of barley? You pay again. Each gate has its own tollman. Each tollman has his own rules. Sometimes it's a penny. Sometimes he wants a sack of onions. Sometimes he just likes your boots and takes those instead. Fringe detail. Some cities taxed windows. Yes, really. More windows meant you had more wealth. So they charged you for the luxury of light. As a result, poorer citizens lived in homes with few or no windows, which made ventilation terrible and disease more likely, all in the name of fairness. Let's not forget the death tax, because even dying cost you. When someone dies, the church often claims a portion of their estate. They call it a soul fee. Some call it robbery. Or the way someone knocks on your door with a ledger and a long face, usually before the body's cold. And the worst part, you don't even know how much you owe. Record keeping is chaotic. Measurements change. Coin weights vary. Some taxes are seasonal. Others are invented on the spot. Meet Tostig, a charcoal seller who arrives at the market with a cart. The tollman says it's 2 pennies. Tostig only has 1. He offers to pay the second on his way out. The tollman agrees, then demands 4 on the return. Rates changed, he says. Tostig throws his hands up. The tollman throws his cart into the river. And don't expect fairness. Nobles don't pay the same taxes. Clergy don't pay most at all. Some merchant families negotiate their own exemptions. And you scrape the bottom, hoping the taxman doesn't notice the extra turnip in your basket. If you refuse to pay, they take something. Your goods, your animals, your tools. Sometimes your door, really. In some towns, tax enforcers removed front doors from defaulting homes so everyone knew you were unclean with debt. It worked. No one visited. Not even the rat catcher. So you get clever. You hide coins in your shoe. You claim your bread is for private use. You say the goat isn't yours. It just likes you. You barter behind closed doors. You whisper. You dodge. You lie. Because survival doesn't care about honesty. But deep down, you know the truth. The taxes will always find you. They're the one part of city life that never burns, never drowns, never rots. They don't sleep. They don't die. They just arrive, smiling, holding a ledger, asking if that sack of grain is really for personal use. And you? You nod. You pay. You mutter a curse under your breath and hope the wind carries it to whatever bureaucratic demon invented the window tax. Because in the medieval city, the only thing harder than staying alive is affording it. You've paid the toll, bribed the guild clerk, bartered 3 eggs for a window tax waiver, and somehow, you've kept your dignity. But now you're facing something even more dangerous than death, taxes or soup that bites back your fellow citizens, because in a medieval city, you were never alone, but rarely safe. People were packed together like salted fish in a barrel. The streets were narrow. Homes were stacked, voices echoed through thin walls. Privacy. That was for saints and nobles. You knew your neighbors' habits, arguments, laundry stains, and the exact pitch of their child's tantrum, and they knew yours. Let's meet Baldwin, a dyer who works out of a basement shop. His walls are blue from spilled indigo. So is his hair. His neighbor, Arnulf, is a tanner who soaks animal hides in vats of lime and urine. The smell seeps into Baldwin's home. Baldwin complains. Arnulf replies with a dead fish on Baldwin's doorstep. This is not unusual, it's city life. Medieval cities were a pressure cooker of class tension, trade competition, family feuds, religious rivalry, and plain old pettiness. One wrong word, and you could be in a brawl, or worse, dragged into a feud that lasts for generations. Historians still argue whether these interpersonal rivalries were acts of desperation, community identity, or just humanity's oldest habit. Blaming the guy next door. One thing's clear. Resentment fermented faster than cider in summer. You didn't just fear strangers, you feared people you knew. Accusations flew like arrows. He shorted me on grain. She's a heretic. They're hoarding salt. And accusations had weight. Gossip alone could ruin your business, damage your chances at marriage, or invite a visit from the local bailiff. And if you were an outsider, someone who looked different, spoke differently, worshipped differently, you were in constant danger. Foreigners were tolerated when they brought wealth. But in times of hardship, they were first to be blamed for plagues, for crop failures, for storms, for rats. Let's meet Isabel, a woman from Aragon who moved to the city with her husband, a merchant. At first, things were fine, but when bread ran short, the whispers began. She speaks strange. She curses bread. She's too clean. One morning, she found her market stall overturned and a fish nailed to her door. Her husband disappeared the next week. No one asked questions. Scapegoating wasn't rare. It was ritual. Jews, foreign merchants, lepers, heretics, midwives, even stray animals. Anyone or anything slightly outside the norm could become the focus of collective fear. Quirky detail. During a particularly bad rat infestation, one city council blamed cats, not the rats. People believed cats were demonic, so they were killed in droves. The rats flourished. So did the plague. Oops, even within your group, danger lurked. Guild members sabotaged each other's goods. Siblings sued over inheritance. Friends turned rivals. There were no contracts, just handshakes and hope. Betrayal was common. Forgiveness was rare. If a fight broke out, and it did, constantly, there were no police to intervene. Maybe the night watch wandered by and muttered something about decency. More likely they joined in or looked the other way. Justice was slow, retribution was fast. Let's meet Morwenna, a brewer, whose cart was bumped by a spice seller in a crowded street. Her barrels toppled, her profits spilled. She chased the man, screamed curses that turned the air red, and bashed his crate with a ladle. A crowd gathered. No one stopped it. 2 children placed bets. The spice seller fled. Morwenna's beer was ruined. Her reputation improved. Don't mess with the brewer, they said. She swings like a knight. In such a volatile environment, you learn to pick your battles and your allies. Friendships were forged over shared bread, whispered complaints, and mutual enemies. You helped your neighbor patch his roof, so he'd help you hide from the taxman. You learned to read faces, to memorize voices in the dark, to watch who bought extra candles, who got quiet during sermons, who stepped over a beggar without blinking. Because survival depended on community, but community could flip fast. There was no such thing as anonymity. You were watched, judged, gossiped about. Your life played out in public, your victories, your failures, your moments of shame. Everyone knew who owed money, who fought with their spouse, who had lice, who lost a child. No secrets, just stories passed from one doorway to the next. And yet there was resilience. People shared, laughed, sang, danced. They celebrated feast days with candles and roasted chestnuts. They stood up for each other, sometimes. They lifted a neighbor's cart out of the mud. They delivered broth to a sick friend. They helped bury a stranger. Because even if the city was cruel, your fellow citizens weren't always. They were scared, tired, itchy, broke, but they were human. So you learned to live among them, not in peace, necessarily, but in motion. Together, breathing the same foul air, walking the same cobblestones, arguing over the same fish. And when the sun went down and your door creaked shut behind you, you whispered a small prayer. Let no one knock tonight. You made it through another day of surviving your neighbors, dodging taxes and swearing under your breath at invisible fleas. As you sit on your wooden stool gnawing the least moldy end of a turnip, you may be wondering, how does anyone survive this for years? Short answer, most didn't. But those who did, those who lived past the coughs, the fires, the betrayals, the bad bread, they had one final nightly ritual, listening to the city come alive with fear. Because in a medieval city, the night wasn't a quiet escape, it was a soundtrack of dread. When the sun set, it didn't just end the workday, it released a cast of characters you'd never meet during market hours. Every creak of a beam, every distant cry, every footstep in gravel sounded closer than it should be. Even the wind seemed to change accents after dark. Let's meet Hilda, an elderly woman who lives alone in the upper room of a slanted house on Deadman's Cross. Every night, she leans on her window and listens. Dogs howling, wood snapping, footsteps passing too slowly. She doesn't sleep. She doesn't light a candle. She just waits. When morning comes, if her door isn't broken and her pot is still hanging over the hearth, she counts it a win. Fear didn't need a face. It just needed possibility. Maybe the black dog would pass by your door. Maybe the dead monk would walk the alley behind the tanner's shop again. Maybe your neighbor's new wife really wasn't blinking enough. Medieval cities were haunted, not always by ghosts, but by memory. Every corner had a story, every alley a whisper. People didn't have horror films, they had lived experiences, and those were worse. And then came the stories, legends told in murmurs over ale or muttered behind cupped hands. There was the story of the bridge builder's apprentice, who fell into the river and now surfaces every year on the same day, bloated and weeping. The story of Sister Alfreda, who cursed the bell tower when the abbot refused her entry. Now the bell tolls 13 times at midnight, only no one hears it with their ears. The tale of the rat man, who walks on 2 legs and speaks with the voice of lost children. Historians still debate whether medieval people believed all these stories or used them as metaphors for real fears, death, injustice, punishment. But what mattered wasn't whether they were true, it was that they might because nothing is scarier than maybe. Fear wasn't just supernatural, it was also legal. A knock on the door at midnight might mean your neighbor accused you of heresy. Maybe someone thought you made their crops fail with a glance. Maybe you were seen washing too early in the morning. That's suspicious. That's unnatural. You could be dragged out of bed, questioned, exiled, or worse, watched. And being watched in a medieval city was often step one toward never being seen again. Let's meet Thomasin, a candle maker who whistled a song no one recognized. By morning, people were whispering. He sings in tongues. His wax burns green. He didn't blink during mass. By week's end, he was gone. His shop was sealed. His candles melted in the sun like ghosts evaporating. And even if no one accused you of anything, night held other dangers. Fires, robbers, walls that collapsed for no reason, roof tiles that fell like executioners, rats with glowing eyes, drunks who thought your door was their bed, people who coughed, choked, and died in their sleep while their family pretended not to notice because a corpse meant burial fees. Fringe detail: some families tied a string to the wrist of a dying relative and fed it through the ceiling to a bell, just in case. If you're not dead, tug. Spoiler: sometimes the bell rang, sometimes no one answered. You think about all this as you lay down on your sack of straw and hope the neighbor upstairs doesn't fall through the ceiling again. You pull your cloak tight. You listen to the city breathing, the groan of wood, the clink of metal, the moan of someone too far gone to scream. You stare into the darkness, and the darkness stares back, not with eyes, but with memory, because every stone you stepped on today was laid by someone who once feared what you now fear, and they're still here, in the creases of the buildings, in the dust between floorboards, in the faint warmth of places where the sun hasn't touched in years. And tomorrow, it starts again. If you're lucky, if the roof holds, if the rats are slow, if the city decides for just one more night to leave you alone, so you turn toward the wall. You close your eyes, and you hope. You wake up stiff, hungry, and vaguely surprised. The sun's up. The ceiling's intact. No one screamed in the alley last night, loud enough to wake you anyway. Congratulations, you've earned another day of surviving a medieval city. But survival isn't the same as comfort, because today, like every other day, you're about to be reminded of how little protection you really have. And that begins the moment you step outside and see the town crier nailing another public notice to the central post. New decree, new punishment, new reason to mind your business and keep your head down. Let's talk about laws, or more accurately, the medieval city's idea of laws, an unpredictable stew of local customs, royal edicts, church commandments, and whatever the bailiff dreamed up after 2 mugs of ale and a conversation with his angry wife. Let's meet Godfrey, a fishmonger who accidentally sold stale trout during a heat wave. He's charged with endangering public morale. His punishment? Standing in the market square wearing a tunic painted with the word rotten. Children laugh. His business dries up faster than the fish. Justice? More like theater. There was no clear distinction between crime and sin. If you swore, you could be fined. If you missed mass, fined. If you danced too enthusiastically on a holy day, fined and accused of consorting with devils. One woman in Bruges was fined 3 times in a month for wearing colors above her station. Her dress was grey. You had to know not just what the law was, but what it looked like to break it, because perception often mattered more than fact. Historians still argue whether this chaotic patchwork of rules maintained order or simply maintained control. Either way, most people lived in a constant state of nervous calculation. Is this action worth the risk of being misunderstood by someone with a stick and a badge? And the enforcers? They weren't exactly impartial. Some were reeves, local officials appointed by the town council. Others were bailiffs, answerable to a lord or magistrate. Some were just guys with weapons and a vague sense of superiority. If you were lucky, they ignored you. If you weren't, they noticed you walking too fast near a bakery and hauled you in for questioning. Let's meet Lutgard, a lace maker who had the audacity to carry a small knife for cutting thread. A passing guard decided it was too long. She tried to explain. He didn't care. She was detained for concealing intent. her lace got trampled, her weak, and don't get caught out after curfew. Medieval cities locked their gates at night. Being outside after dark was automatically suspicious. Merchants, smugglers, travelers, spies, locals, probably drunk, lost, or about to do something regrettable. And if something went wrong, a fight, a fire, a missing child, the city didn't ask why, it asked who, and who was usually whoever looked like they couldn't afford to defend themselves. There were also sumptuary rules about what you could wear. They were designed to preserve the social order. If you were a butcher, you couldn't wear velvet. If you were a blacksmith's wife, no pearls. If you were a servant, earth tones only. If you broke the rule, you were fined, shamed, or in some cases stripped in public and redressed by force. Yes, that happened. Fringe detail: some towns had weighers' seats in the market square. If a woman was suspected of being a witch, a gossip, or a fraudulent vendor, she was weighed against a sack of bread or a goose. If she weighed too little, she was suspected of hiding something like spells or sin. Punishments weren't just cruel, they were creative. Branding, pillories, stocks, fines, shaming, exile, mutilation. One thief had his hand nailed to the city gate for a full hour. A baker caught watering down ale had to drink a full bucket of his own brew, then vomit in front of the crowd. Entertainment for some, a warning for the rest. Let's meet Theobald, a man who accidentally overcharged for firewood during a shortage. The judge sentenced him to carry a bundle of wood through the city wearing a sign that said greed. His customers threw pebbles. He didn't overcharge again. He also didn't smile again. People internalized it. You learned to move quietly, speak cautiously, bow at the right time, and never, ever argue with someone holding a writ of seizure. If you got summoned to court, you went. If you got accused of blasphemy, you begged. If someone said you looked unholy, you went straight to church and donated a candle just to be safe. And the worst part, laws changed. Sometimes overnight. A new lord, a new bishop, a new council decree. Suddenly, what was legal yesterday was treason today. So you stopped asking questions, you adapted, you shortened your hemline, you lowered your voice, you memorized every new rule pinned to the notice board. Because in the medieval city, justice wasn't about right or wrong. It was about not being noticed. Let's say you've managed to avoid the law today. You didn't wear the wrong color, insult the wrong monk, or accidentally sneeze on a relic. But your stomach growls, and that's a problem. Because now you've got to navigate the most precarious system of all in a medieval city. Food, or the daily gamble of what might kill you first. Hunger or the meal itself. Buying food wasn't just a task, it was a high-stakes mission. Markets were chaotic, prices unpredictable, and quality questionable at best. No food inspectors, no refrigeration, no expiration dates, just a desperate hope that the meat you bought was in fact meat, and not last week's dog. Let's meet Ragnar, a widow, with 2 coppers, and a dream of stew. She walks to the butcher's stall, and is offered a fresh leg of mutton. She pokes it. It wobbles. It smells like something that once had hope. The butcher grins. Ragnar sighs and buys beans instead. Again, because meat was a luxury, most people didn't eat it regularly, not unless it was offal, salted scraps, or something that had died under suspicious circumstances. Even fish, ostensibly common, became expensive during fasting days, when everyone suddenly remembered they weren't supposed to eat pork. Supply and demand, baby. Bread, on the other hand, was the backbone of the medieval diet, and it could be challenging. If you were poor, you bought black bread, dense, gritty, and often filled with more filler than flour. Sometimes it was stretched with ground-up beans, acorns, or even powdered chalk. Crunchy, not in a good way. Rich folk ate white bread, which was sifted and soft and possibly blessed by angels. The rest of the city dreamed about it while chewing something that tasted like roofing tile. And yes, bread could kill you. Some bakers tried to increase their profit by mixing in toxic ingredients like alum or old plaster dust to make their loaves seem whiter. Historians still argue how common this was, but several city ordinances banned false flowers, so probably enough to worry about. Let's meet Allard, A journeyman mason who saved up for a wedding loaf, a beautiful round of white bread to impress his future in-laws. Half the guests vomited, one passed out. The baker was fined. A lard's wedding was moved to the stable. The goats were uninvited. Fringe detail. In one town, if you were caught selling underweight bread, the punishment was to be nailed by the ear to the market stall for an hour, literally pinned to your shame. It's unclear what happened if you passed out from the pain, but probably nothing comforting. Then there was dairy. If you could afford it, you bought cheese. If you couldn't, you made peace with the fact that your neighbor's goat milk might be watered down, or worse, stored in a skin pouch that hadn't been cleaned since the last plague. Eggs, seasonal and fragile. Fruits, spoiled fast. Vegetables, heavily seasonal, often wormy, and not something you recognized out of season. Remember, this was before tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, or corn ever made it to Europe. No fries, no salsa, just turnips, always turnips. Water was, famously, dangerous. You could drink it if you liked gambling with dysentery. So you drank ale instead. Weak ale, sure, but still enough to keep you mildly buzzed and hopefully unpoisoned. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. The priest drank it. Your cat might have sipped it. Let's meet Yadava, a brewer's daughter, who could identify the exact stage of fermentation by smell. Her family made weak ale for breakfast, stronger ale for feasts, and an emergency ale called crippler for negotiations. One sip, no lies, just floor. The church, of course, tried to regulate everything. Fasting days were enforced, especially during Lent, when the sale of meat was forbidden. People got clever. Beaver tails were classified as fish. So were barnacle geese. Monks held debates about whether otters had souls or scales. They don't. Or do. Depends on the abbot. Food preservation was its own art and tragedy. You salted meat until it became jerky. You pickled vegetables until they wept brine. You smoked, dried, buried, or fermented whatever you could. Most cellars smelled like desperation and vinegar. Spoiled food? Common. You developed a nose for it, a tolerance, or both. You scraped mold off the cheese and hoped the blue didn't mean it had aspirations of movement. If it wiggled, you cooked it longer. You also dealt with food theft. Rats stole what you couldn't hide. Neighbors stole what rats didn't find. Children were trained to spot movement near the grain sacks and alert the house. If they failed, dinner got smaller. Let's not forget famine. 1, bad harvest. Panic. 2, starvation. Cities imported grain when they could afford it. But during shortages, prices soared. Riots broke out. Bakers were attacked. Bread carts overturned. And then came the scavenging. Bark, roots, even leather. And yes, there are recorded cases of cannibalism during sieges. When food was gone, and people were gone, and only bones remained. What happened next is something no one sang songs about. Even in good times, food was fragile. A warm day could spoil everything. A rat could ruin your winter stores. A dishonest vendor could sell you a pie filled with questionable meat, a side of nausea, and a free existential crisis. And yet, people ate. They cooked with love. They shared what they had. A pot of pottage, bubbling over a smoky fire, fed a family. Herbs gathered from the city edge added flavor. A stale loaf became toast. A thin stew became a feast, if you closed your eyes. Because in a medieval city, food wasn't about enjoyment. It was about making it to the next meal. So, after all the drama of just trying to eat something that won't haunt your intestines, you'd think a little drink might help smooth things over. Well, it does. Sort of. But in a medieval city, drinking was less about enjoyment and more about collective survival. Low-key chaos and very public brawling. Because when your water's poisoned, your food's suspicious, and your roof leaks, you drink. Let's start with the basics. Ale. Everyone drank it. Infants, pregnant women, elders. The ale was usually small ale, low in alcohol, enough to hydrate, but not enough to leave you singing dirges to goats. It was the Gatorade of the medieval world. minus the electrolytes and brand loyalty. Then came beer, stronger and flavored with hops, more common in Germanic regions, and wine, the classy cousin, mostly imported or reserved for clergy and the upper crust. If you were rich, your wine came from France. If you were poor, it was watered-down sludge with a suspicious aftertaste and notes of vinegar. And then there was mead, honey wine, rare, expensive, a drink you might get a sip of if you married well, robbed better, or worked in a monastery with a loose inventory. Let's meet Lambert, a tavern boy who learned early that spilling ale on a customer's lap meant ducking quickly and apologizing twice. He's 12. He can pour from a cask blindfolded, and he once saw a man trade a mule for 3 mugs of dragon-spiced mead that turned out to be goat's milk with ginger. Because taverns weren't restaurants, they were loud, dimly lit, and barely supervised. Think unlicensed therapy, chaotic reunions, verbal combat, and the occasional fistfight involving a lute. Historians still argue whether taverns were centers of bonding or breeding grounds for rebellion. The truth is, they were both. People laughed, cried, confessed, schemed, fought, proposed marriage, and sang ballads about soup. It was human, messy, raw, and real. One quirk of medieval drinking: no one drank alone. It was communal. Sharing a drink meant trust. Refusing a drink? Suspicious. Drinking too fast. Desperate. Too slow. Arrogant. Too sober. Why? Let's meet Genevieve, a mason's wife, known for winning ale-drinking contests against men twice her size. She claimed ale made her joints hurt less. Others suspected divine intervention or hollow legs. She once drank a visiting friar under the table and convinced him to bless her chicken coop. Of course, the drinking came with risks. Overindulgence could get you fined. Public drunkenness was technically illegal unless it happened during a feast day, in which case it was expected merriment. Double standards? Absolutely. And then there were tavern brawls. The medieval equivalent of live sports. No tickets, no rules, no referees. Just a slippery floor, one too many insults about someone's beard, and 2 guys who probably hadn't slept in 3 days. Let's meet Alfred, a weaver who lost 3 teeth in a brawl over who invented pottage. He still swears it was his grandmother. The man who disagreed left with a broken nose and a firm opinion about lentils. Sometimes these fights got serious. Sometimes people died, and when they did, the tavern simply closed for a day out of respect, then reopened with a new name and stronger ale. Fringe detail? Some cities had official ale tasters. It was their job to taste ale from every tavern to ensure quality and fair pricing. Unsurprisingly, this job was considered a privilege, and many tasters took their duties very seriously by making lots of repeat visits for science. And women? Oh, they drank too. Alewives brewed much of the city's drink. Many ran their own taverns, served regulars, and developed reputations that could make or break neighborhoods. Let's meet Rohaline, an alewife known for brewing truth serum, a dark, bitter brew that made everyone at the table confess something within 20 minutes. She kept a ledger of secrets, never wrote anything down, and never ran out of customers. But not all drink was merry. For many, alcohol was escape. Escape from the hunger, the plague, the bills, the losses. You drank to forget. You drank because you couldn't fix your roof, but you could numb the cold. You drank because tomorrow didn't guarantee a better outcome. And then there were the public festivals, feast days, market days, saints' days, when the entire city seemed to dissolve into a kind of ritualized inebriation. Jugglers performed, musicians played off-key tunes, fire breathers ignited their eyebrows, and somewhere, a dancing bear questioned his life choices. By evening, half the crowd was drunk. By midnight, someone was in the fountain. And by morning, everyone denied everything. This wasn't the clean, curated joy of modern celebration. It was primal, loud, spontaneous, and necessary. Because when every day is built on disease, poverty, fear, and back pain, you make room for joy wherever it fits, even if it has fleas and smells like cabbage. So tonight, after your meager dinner, you wander to the local tavern. You greet the alewife, you order something warm and bitter, you find a bench, you clink mugs with strangers, and for a brief, flickering moment before the bread riots resume, before the rats return, before the bell tolls again, you feel like maybe, just maybe, this city isn't trying to kill you after all. You stumble out of the tavern with a head full of warm fog and a belly full of what might technically qualify as ale. The night is chill, the stars are dim, and your eyelids are growing heavy. Time to collapse on your straw sack and hope your neighbor doesn't mistake your snores for demonic possession again. But just as you start drifting off, you itch, then again, and again. Welcome to the deeply underappreciated nightmare of medieval infestations. Fleas, lice, mites, bedbugs, ticks, worms, fleas again, and their best friends, rats. Let's start with the lice, the most intimate enemy you'll never stop hosting. They weren't just in your hair, they were in your clothes, your seams, your bedding, your life. Everyone had them. Nobles picked at them under velvet robes. Peasants itched them during sermons. Children traded them like playing cards. Let's meet Adelina, a spinner, who wore 2 tunics just to reduce the crawling sensation at night. She boiled her underclothes once a month, hung them in smoke, and still couldn't go a day without scratching. She called them her tiny roommates. She never laughed when she said it. You couldn't escape them. Historians still argue whether people even tried. Some washed weekly, others soaked their shirts in lye and prayed, but for most, it was just part of the background misery. You didn't fight the lice, you adapt. Then came fleas, which were less subtle. They bit, they multiplied, they hitched rides on every furry animal and human cuff. And sometimes, just sometimes, they carried a special surprise. Yersinia pestis, you might know it better as the Black Death. Yep, that flea that just bit your ankle. If this were 1347, it might be bringing you a surprise that ends in 3 days of delirium and a nice shallow grave. But even if plague didn't visit, scratching became second nature. Everyone did it. It wasn't rude. It wasn't gross. It was necessary. If you didn't scratch, people assumed you were either dead or a witch. Let's meet Odo, a tailor's apprentice who developed what he called the flea jig, a subtle shuffle and scratch maneuver performed while hemming sleeves. He taught it to his brothers. They won't stop doing it, even in their sleep. Fringe detail. Some people tried sprinkling ashes into their clothes to repel pests. Others wore bundles of herbs. A few desperate souls lined their sleeves with fur, hoping fleas would prefer it to skin. That worked until the fur started moving. And don't forget bedbugs. They loved wood. And since your entire house was probably made of wood walls, beds, stools, spoons, you basically lived in a buffet. People tried setting their furniture on fire just to purge it. Risky. But honestly, understandable. Of course, if you had animals in your home, and you probably did, you also had mites, ticks, and tapeworms as house guests. Chickens brought red mites, dogs brought fleas, pigs brought everything. Let's meet Evelyn, a pig farmer's daughter, who once woke up to find a hen nesting in her cloak. The hen laid an egg. Evelyn ate it. She claims it gave her clarity. We believe it gave her salmonella. It wasn't just skin pests. Parasites were everywhere. If you drank from the wrong stream, worms. Ate the wrong stew, worms. Didn't boil your grain long enough. Surprise. Even your best meal could come with a second, wriggling course. And hygiene. It wasn't like people didn't care. They just didn't have the tools. Soap was harsh, rare, and used mostly for laundry. Combs helped, but couldn't eliminate lice. Baths were communal, infrequent, and not always hot or safe. In some cities, bathhouses were considered sinful. In others, they were breeding grounds for gossip and syphilis. So you developed strategies. You picked lice by firelight. You shook out your sheets. You scratched in unison. You gave up on shame. Some cities had delousing days, where everyone paused to hunt their own scalp guests. Others didn't bother. They simply wore amulets to ward off pests. Spoiler, they didn't work. But the placebo effect scratched some of the itch. Let's meet Mikkel, a chimney sweep who swore by his grandmother's flea cure, rubbing onion skins on his arms every morning, and never making eye contact with cats. It didn't help, but it gave him purpose. And rats. Oh, the rats ran the show. They climbed walls, scuttled beams, nested in thatch. They were bold, audacious. They chewed shoes, stole candles, and sometimes bit sleeping infants. Your cat was supposed to handle them. Your cat usually gave up. But it was never just about the pests. It was about the constant, low-level irritation, the skin-crawling awareness that something was always living on you, biting you, breeding on you. It wore you down. It frayed your patience. It made you dream of rivers, clean linen, and a world where you didn't have to boil your socks for survival. And yet, like everything else in this grimy, glorious city, you adapted, you scratched, you swatted, you picked, you kept living. Because you weren't trying to be comfortable. You were just trying to stay one inch ahead of the filth. By now, you've survived another brutal day in the city. Law dodged, bread secured, fleas battled, and ale absorbed. You limp back toward home, which is really just a wooden box posing as shelter, and you sigh as the door creaks shut behind you. And you brace yourself, because the worst part of living in a medieval city might just be the house itself. Let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval city homes were terrible, cramped, dark, smoky, crooked, and if you were lucky, only mildly flammable. Let's meet Hilda, a blacksmith's wife, who spent 5 years saving up to buy her own front door. Before that, her home was just a curtain and a prayer. Now she's got a real threshold and a latch. She guards it like treasure. Most houses were built fast and cheap, especially in cities where space was tight and growing populations demanded more dwellings. That meant timber frames, wattle and daub walls, maybe a stone base if the builder had aspirations. Floors, dirt, or wood if you had connections. Roofs, thatch, tile, or wooden shingles, each with its own curse. Thatch caught fire, tiles cracked, wood leaked, and in winter, you discovered the joy of indoor frost. Ceilings were low, beams exposed, and windows, maybe a hole with an oiled cloth over it. Glass was rare and expensive. Your best view was fogged up with soot and the smell of the neighbor's turnip stew leaking through the walls. Let's meet Wilrick, a tanner who once fell through his upstairs floorboards while trying to hang herbs, landed in the soup pot. Wife screamed. Herbs ruined. Back door never closed right again. And space, forget it. You shared a room with your spouse, your children, maybe your cousin, your goat, and 3 inexplicably territorial chickens. Beds were for the rich. You probably slept on a straw mat or a board. Blankets were thin, lice, thick. Historians still argue whether people ever really slept well back then, with noise from outside, drafts from every corner, and smoke curling from your hearth like an angry ghost. Most medieval rest was not restful. And don't even ask about plumbing. Toilets, chamber pots, if you had one, otherwise, a bucket, maybe an alley. And if you lived near a public latrine, congratulations, you were on the fast track to eternal nose trauma. Fringe detail? In London, one public toilet was built on a bridge over the Thames. Waste dropped straight into the river. Efficient, revolting, very medieval. If you wanted to clean up, your options were laughable. There was no private bath, maybe a wooden tub in the kitchen. Water was hauled from a well or a public fountain. Cold, heavy, not always clean. Soap? Harsh and lye-based. Got the dirt off and possibly your skin too. You didn't use it often. Neither did anyone else. Let's meet you Sabot, a dyer who refused to wash her hands during Lent because the last time she did, her nails turned black. Turns out, the soap she used was mostly sheep fat and ash. Cleansing? Sure. Spiritually and epidermally traumatizing? Also yes. Cooking? You had a fire pit or hearth. Maybe a clay oven if you were posh. Most meals were made in one pot. Smoke filled the room. Sparks flew. Children were told to stay away, but no one really listened. Burns were common, so were chimney fires. And if your house caught fire, which it could, with terrifying ease, you were out of luck. Cities didn't have fire departments. Neighbors threw water if they could. Mostly, they watched and hoped it didn't spread to their roof. One man in Ghent tried to save his home by peeing on the flames. It didn't work, but it made the chroniclers laugh. Even when everything didn't go up in flames, the house itself never felt safe. No locks, no insulation, rats in the rafters, spiders in your shoes, cold in your bones. It creaked in the night and groaned in the wind, and during storms, you prayed it would hold. Let's meet Berengar, a cobbler who tied his rafters together with old shoelaces because the wind kept ripping them apart. His house leaned like a drunk sailor. His wife threatened to move into the shed. The shed declined the offer. Sometimes, your house was also your business. Tailors worked in their kitchens. Weavers hung looms from the rafters. Bakers built ovens in the back room and hoped the flour didn't spontaneously combust. The more you did in one space, the more that space suffocated you. Work, sleep, cook, wash, pray, argue. Everything happened in one tight smoke-filled room, and privacy. That was for the nobility. You changed behind a curtain. You argued in whispers. You cried into your sleeve. And if you had to share your room with a sick relative, get ready for long nights of coughing, retching, and one-sided conversations with God. And yet, for all its flaws, your home was still yours. It kept the worst of the wind out. It gave you a place to sit, to eat, to hope. You patched the cracks. You stuffed wool into holes. You lined the walls with straw and dreams. Because in the medieval city, your house didn't need to be beautiful, or spacious, or warm. It just needed to not collapse before you did. If you've made it this far without snapping, congratulations. You're emotionally resilient, physically itchy, and probably overdue for a terrible surprise. Because just when you think you've adjusted to medieval city life, your neighbor dies. And in a medieval city, death wasn't just a family matter. It was a public event, a logistical nightmare, and a constantly looming roommate. Let's start with the obvious. People died a lot. Old age was a rare achievement. Infant mortality was cruelly high. Women died in childbirth. Men died from infected wounds. Children died from coughing too loudly near the wrong well. Historians still argue whether the average life expectancy was 30-40 years, because people truly lived short lives, or because so many infants died young. It brought the average down. Either way, you buried a lot of friends, and usually, in the same week you met them. Let's meet Beatrix, a midwife who had helped birth more babies than she could count and buried half of them before their first birthday. She whispered prayers with her hands still stained in afterbirth, hoping one would stick. Her husband made coffins part-time. Their backyard was very, very quiet. And when someone died, everything stopped. For a minute, then things got grimly practical. You had to wrap the body, usually in linen, if you could afford it, sometimes just in old clothes. Then came the process of transporting the body, which usually involved a cart, some family, and the hope that the city dogs didn't follow you. Let's meet Aldous, a candle maker, who accidentally left a corpse cart unattended for 2 minutes outside the chapel. When he came back, it had 2 fewer shoes, and a very guilty dog sitting beside it. The priest refused to perform the rite until the shoes were returned. The wake, often held in the home, candles lit, people prayed, wept, or whispered awkward things. The smell wasn't great, ventilation was a myth, and if the death was sudden, people immediately wondered, was it contagious? Because medieval cities were no strangers to plagues. Capital P and lowercase, bubonic, pneumonic, dysentery, measles, leprosy. You name it, someone died of it, probably your uncle, probably last week. And burial? Well, that got complicated. Cities were tight on space. Graveyards filled fast. Sometimes you shared a grave. Sometimes you were buried shallow, and the next flood washed your story away. If you were rich, you got a tomb. If you were poor, you got a quick burial and a quicker forgetting. Fringe detail? Some churchyards were so overcrowded they dug up old bones to make room. The bones were stored in ossuaries, charnel houses, neatly stacked, skulls, femurs, ribs, all arranged like grim Lego bricks. artful, horrifying, very efficient. Let's meet Gervais, a gravedigger with one working eye and a very casual relationship with ghosts. He could bury 6 people in a day. 7, if you didn't mind uneven ground. Once he buried a man who coughed mid-shovelful. No one speaks of it. And if you couldn't afford a burial at all, the body might be left at the city's edge, or near the river, or quietly burned. Yes, cremation wasn't common, but desperation makes strange choices. Some towns banned it outright, others just looked away. And while you were grieving, you also had to worry about your possessions. Death meant inheritance. That meant legal disputes. That meant someone, probably a cousin, arguing over who got your broken stool and half a jug of wine. Let's meet Isabeau, a widow whose husband's brother claimed her oven as ancestral property. She threw bread dough at him. He threw a stool. The priest ruled in favor of the bread. The oven stayed. So did the drama. But here's the twist. Death wasn't always feared. It was constant, familiar. People joked about it, prayed about it, sang about it, painted it on walls. The dance of death became a common image, skeletons leading people of all classes in one final jig, equalizing, inescapable, weirdly stylish. People wrote wills, not just to pass on property, but to make peace with their sins. A good death meant a quick one, with confession. A bad death, alone, unshriven, or during a thunderstorm. Those were seen as signs you had unresolved issues with the divine. And sometimes, people staged elaborate deathbed theatrics. Dying relatives made speeches, gave away trinkets, claimed visions. One baker reportedly confessed to watering down his bread for 12 years, then begged for flour as penance. His daughter, Merelda, still swears he saw angels. His son just wanted the recipe. Even children were taught to prepare for death. Prayers were memorized. Graves were visited. And yes, some carried tiny wooden skulls as a reminder. Memento mori. Remember you will die. Cheerful, right? But in a world where everything tried to kill you, fire, famine, rats, roofs, death became less of a stranger and more like an awkward uncle. He showed up unannounced, took too much, stayed too long. But somehow, you made room for him. Because in the medieval city you didn't run from death. You learned to make peace with it, or at least to leave a good candle burning when you heard the coughing start. Let's say by some absurd miracle, you've survived the dysentery, sidestepped the rats, dodged the fires, and slept through the lice. You've buried friends, patched your roof, and figured out the right time to avoid the baker's sawdust loaves. You're not rich, but you're alive. Now, let's talk about your job. More specifically, what it meant to be a working artisan in a medieval city, respected but starving. In theory, skilled tradespeople were the engine of the city. Carpenters, cobblers, weavers, masons, smiths. They built the world. Their work was essential, revered even. But you know what doesn't pay well? Being essential. Let's meet Odric, a cobbler who made boots for half the town but walked barefoot year-round. His hands were calloused, his eyes strained, and his best customer still paid him in moldy onions and a favor he never explained. Artisans like Odric were part of the guild system, if they were lucky. Guilds were exclusive clubs for craftsmen. Join one, and you got protections, better pay, some prestige. But getting in, good luck. First you started as an apprentice, a glorified servant who swept the floor, stirred the glue, fetched water, and prayed not to burn the shop down. You worked for free, often for years. Then came the journeyman phase, where you traveled from city to city, working odd jobs, learning techniques, and sleeping in haylofts. If you were lucky, you got paid. If not, you got experience. Only after years of toil, savings, and a masterpiece of your work would you earn the title of master, and with it the right to open your own shop. Historians still argue whether the guilds helped elevate skilled labor, or whether they just created a medieval version of closed-door elitism. Either way, if you weren't in, you were out. And outside, starvation. Let's meet Cleata, a glassblower's daughter who could shape molten sand into delicate goblets at age 11. But when her father died, the guild refused to admit her. She sold her pieces in the alley, under a blanket, dodging officials. Her goblets were flawless, her hands bled from hiding them. Being an artisan meant endless work, unpredictable income, and constant negotiation with people who didn't understand your craft but still wanted a discount. It meant late nights, broken tools, and city officials who taxed you 3 times for the same corner stall. And competition, cutthroat. If your wool was 1% thinner, your customers vanished. If your ale was cloudy, you were cursed. If your pottery cracked, rumors spread that you'd angered the saints. Fringe detail? Some guilds had initiation rituals, dramatic, strange, sometimes bordering on hazing. Tailors swore oaths by golden needles. Masons passed around symbolic stone tools. Shoemakers once buried a new pair of boots during induction. Why? Mystery. Possibly wine. Let's meet Jeffrey, a candle maker who lit his own robe on fire during his induction ritual. He survived, barely. His beard did not. From that day forward, every candle he made came with a whispered apology. And even if you succeeded, made it into the guild, opened your shop, gained customers, you still weren't safe. Fires could destroy your entire livelihood in minutes. A single rumor could ruin your name. A lord's decree could demand free work for the honor of your craft. And then there were the taxes, market fees, guild dues, street permits, material levies. You paid for the right to sell, the space to stand, and the air you breathe. Let's meet Jose, a weaver who once paid 5 different officials just to hang his sign above his stall. When he hung a second sign advertising a sale, they fined him for excessive enthusiasm. But despite it all, people endured. They passed down their craft. They trained apprentices. They carved initials into wood, glazed tiles with care, and sang while hammering iron at dawn. Because even in poverty, there was pride. Pride in the stitching. Pride in the polish. Pride in knowing that, when the cathedral needed a stained glass rose, it was your uncle who made it shimmer. And yes, they were respected, sometimes. On feast days, when the nobles needed shoes, or when a plague passed, and people clung to the comfort of anything handmade. But day to day, you were still just another cog in the muddy, miserable, magnificent machine that was medieval city life. You worked until your fingers bled, then sewed the cuts shut with thread you dyed yourself. Because in the city, survival wasn't about wealth, it was about usefulness. And you, at least, were useful. Imagine this. You've clawed your way to competence in your trade. You're not rich, but you eat. Your boots match. Your roof mostly holds. Life in the city still sucks, but it's a tolerable kind of suck. Then suddenly, there's a commotion in the square. A torch is lit. A whisper becomes a shout. Someone new has arrived in town, and within hours everything you've built can be taken away. Because you're not from here. Let's talk about one of the ugliest truths of medieval city life. If you weren't born inside the walls, or didn't look, speak, or pray the right way, you were an outsider. And outsiders were blamed for, well, everything. Let's meet Moishe, a traveling spice seller. He was Jewish, educated, and fluent in 5 languages. But in the eyes of the locals, he was a walking target. When a child went missing, they blamed him. When a fire broke out, they blamed him. When prices rose, they blamed him again. Historians still argue whether xenophobia in medieval cities was fueled more by religion, ignorance, or pure economic jealousy. But the effect was the same. If you were different, you were suspect. Jews, Muslims, foreigners, migrants from neighboring villages, Romani people. Anyone who didn't blend seamlessly into the tapestry of the city was subject to whispers, suspicion, persecution, and sometimes outright violence. Fringe detail. In some cities, Jews were forced to live in separate quarters, later called ghettos. In others, they had to wear specific badges or hats. It didn't stop the hatred. It just made them easier to find when things went wrong. Let's meet Aliyah, a midwife from the Levant, who settled in Marseille. Her remedies were brilliant, her herbs potent, and her hands steady. But when the plague hit, she was blamed for cursing the wells. She fled in the night, leaving her mortar, her pestle, and her only son's grave behind. Even within the Christian majority, Suspicion of outsiders persisted. A Flemish shoemaker might be barred from setting up shop in Paris. A German mason might be told to move on in Milan. Accents were mocked, clothes scrutinized, traditions twisted into threats. And yet cities needed outsiders. They brought trade, skills, news, and exotic goods. They filled roles locals didn't want. They told stories of far-off lands and taught new techniques. And still, when panic struck, they became scapegoats. During times of famine, the foreigners hoarded the grain. During floods, the outsiders offended God. During plague, they poisoned the wells. Let's meet Dario, a miller from Genoa. He had the misfortune of arriving in Toulouse 2 days before a market fire. He'd never lit a torch in his life. He was chased out with stones before he could sell a single bag of flour. Sometimes, the hatred was institutionalized. Town councils passed laws banning non-natives from owning property, marrying locals, joining guilds, speaking their own language in public. Other times, it was casual, a sideways glance at the tavern, a spit on your cloak, a muttered insult you pretended not to hear, for safety. Let's meet Lenka, a bohemian seamstress who embroidered saints so finely, priests fought for her services. But when a noble accused her of cursing his shirt, her shop was looted, her clients vanished, her name disappeared from the guild rolls. Cities were paradoxes, places of opportunity, yet gates were guarded, places of trade, yet minds were closed, places of growth, yet hearts were small. You could contribute everything, labor, money, knowledge, and still be told you didn't belong. You might save a city from fire, then be accused of starting the blaze for attention. You might feed an orphan, then be whispered about as a witch. Because the medieval city was afraid. Afraid of difference, afraid of change, afraid that one stranger could break the fragile illusion of control that held the filth and fear in check. Let's meet Basil, a Syrian mapmaker, who arrived in Venice with parchment, ink, and a dream. His maps were so detailed they helped traders reach Alexandria safely. But one winter, a boat sank. Survivors blamed the map. Basil was thrown in the canal. He survived, moved inland, never drew again. And yet, for every tragedy, there were glimmers. A Saxon metalsmith, adopted by a French village. A Moorish healer, protected by grateful mothers. A Jewish financier, who helped rebuild a burned town square. But those were rare and fragile. Because in a city where disease and hunger and war were constant, the easiest relief was finding someone else to blame. Someone different. And so, if you were an outsider in a medieval city, you walked softly, you watched your back, you whispered your prayers, and you hoped the wind didn't carry your name when the next fire started. By now, you've worked, wept, healed, and hurt. In this city, you've faced death, rats, rain, rumors, and the kind of bread that shouldn't legally be called bread. You've nearly adapted, but just when you're beginning to believe you understand the rhythm of medieval city life. Boom! A horn blares, a bell tolls, panic surges like a flood. Because the city is under attack. Let's meet Giraud, a grizzled city watchman who's been on the walls for 20 years. He's missing 3 fingers, has 1 eye, and can fall asleep standing up. His motto, if it moves, shout. If it keeps moving, hit it. Today, he's shouting. The medieval city, for all its faults, did try to protect itself. Walls, towers, moats, gates that closed at sundown with satisfying thuds. You'd think that meant security. You'd be wrong, because most city defenses were underfunded, patched together, and maintained by people who were either unpaid, drunk, or both. Historians still argue whether medieval cities were truly defensible or just performance art for anxious populations. A big wall looks impressive until someone brings a ladder or a catapult. And invaders? They came in all flavors. Sometimes it was a rival lord, sometimes a king who didn't like your taxes, sometimes mercenaries who liked your wine. Sometimes it wasn't even war, just a peasant revolt, or a guild riot, or a really aggressive bake sale gone wrong. Let's meet Yuzenda, a brewer's wife who once had to defend her doorstep with a ladle. Someone thought her barrel held stolen grain. It held soup. She lost the soup. She won the fight. When an attack came, chaos reigned. Bells clanged. Gates slammed shut. People screamed. Men grabbed axes. Women grabbed children. Everyone grabbed their most stealable possessions. If you were lucky, the walls held. If not, the streets turned into slaughter lanes. Fringe detail. Some cities built hidden escape tunnels for wealthy families. You know, just in case the poor got angry. Not always effective, but very symbolic. Let's meet Raymond, a silversmith who tried to flee through a tunnel his grandfather carved under their wine cellar. The tunnel had collapsed decades ago. Raymond made it 6 feet, lost a shoe, and returned home in shame. He lived. The shoe did not. Even when the city wasn't physically attacked, internal violence was always simmering. Riots over food, guild clashes, religious processions turning bloody. All it took was a rumor. The baker hoards flour, or the bishop insulted the virgin, or the blacksmith's apprentice looked funny at the mayor's dog, and suddenly the streets were burning. Let's meet Milo, a monk who accidentally triggered a riot by preaching about divine punishment. He meant sin. The crowd thought taxes. A bakery was looted. Someone set fire to the font. Milo was banned from sermons for a month, and the city guard, usually overwhelmed, they had pikes, mismatched armor, and a strong distaste for running. Often they just blocked key roads and waited. Sometimes they joined in, depending on the riot's flavor. And yet, when the threat passed, whether it was foreign or local, the city always tried to go back to normal. Hammers returned to nails. Bells rang for mass. Street vendors resumed shouting about eels. But you remembered. You remembered the smell of smoke, the sobbing of a woman whose husband didn't come back, the silence where the cooper's shop used to be. You remembered that in this city, peace was temporary. Everything was temporary, especially peace. And so you kept your boots near the door. You didn't hang your best coat. You cached a coin or two in a loose floorboard, just in case. Because if the walls ever fell, or the people inside them turned on each other, no saint or soldier was going to save you. Only your wits, your neighbors, and maybe the luck of a house that hadn't yet burned down. Let's take a moment. You've been starved, taxed, blamed, chased, infested, burned, nearly trampled and insulted by a man selling onions from a bag that's clearly leaking. And yet, the medieval city wasn't all misery. No, sometimes it got even worse, because you had to deal with the law, not justice, not fairness, not even logic, just the law. Let's meet Ranulph, a tanner's apprentice who once got fined for hurling disrespectful glances. At whom? Unknown. Who filed the complaint? Anonymous. What was the evidence? A chicken squawked at the wrong time. Verdict: guilty. Fine. A week's wages and a public apology to the chicken. Law in the medieval city was a mess. It was local, inconsistent, and often improvised. One street might follow Roman codes, the next followed feudal custom, and the third just did whatever the oldest man in town shouted the loudest. Historians still argue whether medieval urban laws were meant to create order or just reinforce power. The reality: they mostly reinforced confusion. Courts were small, often held in churches or the town hall, or wherever someone had enough benches. There were juries sometimes, or councils, or just a single cranky magistrate with a feathered hat and a stomachache. Punishments ranged from fines to flogging to shaming. Let's meet Guillemette, a baker's daughter accused of overweighing her buns. The court made her stand outside the market, holding 2 lead weights and a sign that said, "I am too generous." Her customers doubled. Her father fumed. Trials? If they happened, they were loud, confusing, and often decided by social rank. Witnesses were unreliable. Records were rare. Interpretation was flexible. And if you were poor, foreign, or just unlucky, justice became more of a street performance. There were even trial by ordeal options still floating around. Carry hot iron, pull a stone from boiling water, survive without bandages. If your wounds healed clean, you were innocent. If not, well, at least you got an answer. Fringe detail: in some cities, you could swear your innocence on compurgators, friends who swore you were good. It worked, unless one of them owed taxes or smelled like crime. But here's the fun part: Laws weren't always enforced, they were threats. The rulebook existed more to control behavior than to reflect real outcomes. For example, spitting on the street? Technically illegal. Enforcement? Only if you hit the mayor's boots. Or take curfew laws. Bells rang at sunset. Streets were supposed to clear. But if you were a night soil man or a midwife or just drunk with good legs, you roamed anyway. If caught, you bribed the guard. If the guard was drunker than you just nodded and kept walking. Let's meet Oswin, a chimney sweep who got arrested for being out after curfew with a live goose and no explanation. His defense: it's a rescue mission. The judge laughed. The goose honked. Oswin was fined a loaf of bread. The goose was released on its own recognizance. And then there were the sumptuary laws, rules, about what you could wear. If you weren't nobility, you couldn't wear certain fabrics, colors or hat shapes. Yes, Let's meet Agatha, a widow who liked to wear velvet. She was fined for impersonating a lady. Her defense: I found it in a ditch. Verdict: half fine, half pity. She got to keep the sleeves. City guards were the law's face, but most were underpaid, undertrained, and sometimes under the influence. Their weapons: staves, pikes, and impatience. Disputes were common. A spilled ale, a bumped elbow, an insult that felt just a little too real. Fights erupted fast, and often the punishment wasn't official, it was social. You lost face, you lost trade, you lost your good spot in the market queue. Let's meet Tybalt, a fishmonger who threw a mackerel at a rival and missed. It hit a nun. He apologized with a free fillet. She accepted but never forgave. She told every parishioner the story. He still called fish slap in 3 boroughs. And don't forget the stocks. Public shaming was a favorite penalty. Thieves, gossips, blasphemers, or just folks who annoyed the mayor, strapped into wooden frames in the town square. Rain or shine, people jeered. Children threw cabbage. Some threw compliments, but only ironically. You sat there. You thought about your choices. You caught a cold, maybe a rat. And maybe, just maybe, you re-entered society with a little less pride and a lot more cabbage smell. Because in a medieval city, the law wasn't about truth. It was about order, and order was maintained with sticks, smirks, and the ever-looming threat of a magistrate with gout. So you kept your head down, you learned what you could say, what you could sell, what you could wear. And you prayed daily, earnestly, that you'd never end up holding a sign that read, I lied about my eggs. You've survived law and order, barely. You've endured taxes, filth, famine, fire, and neighbors who argue about saints louder than they pray to them. But now, we reach one of the strangest things about life in a medieval city. Time. Not clocks, not calendars, not schedules with neat checkboxes, but how people in these cities understood and moved through time. And here's the twist. It didn't tick the way yours does. Let's meet Izan, a bell ringer who couldn't read, write, or count past 20, but he was the human metronome of his town. When his bell rang, the market opened. When it rang again, people stopped drinking. When it rang a third time, someone had probably died. Time wasn't measured in hours and minutes. It was measured in bells, prayers, candles, and hunger. A monk might divide the day into matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Sound confusing? It was, especially when the sun didn't cooperate and church clocks weren't synchronized with anything, including each other. For most city dwellers, time meant when the rooster crows, after the priest eats, 3 ales past noon, when Bertram's shadow reaches the latrine wall. Historians still argue whether this loose perception of time made life feel slower, simpler, or just incredibly inefficient. What's clear is punctuality was not a medieval virtue. Let's meet Elodie, a seamstress who promised to finish a noble's tunic by the next market day. The noble assumed that meant Thursday. Elodie meant the next Thursday. Her punishment: the tunic was worn to court half sewn. The noble pretended it was avant-garde. No one believed him. The idea of planning weeks ahead, that was for monks, lords, or doom prophets. For most people, it was enough to plan until sundown. Maybe until Sunday. Occasionally until the harvest. Anything beyond that. Dangerous optimism. Calendars existed, yes. But they were based on feast days, saint days, moon cycles, and royal whims. People didn't say, it's August 3rd. They said it's the feast of Saint Nicasius, or 2 days past Saint Swithin's Eve. Confused. So were most people. Fringe detail? Leap years existed, but explaining them often required a priest, a mathematician, and divine intervention. Some towns just skipped a day and blamed it on demons. And clocks. Technically, they began appearing in the 14th century, but not in homes. They were massive, creaky, bell-striking contraptions placed on towers where no one could read the hands anyway. Let's meet Hugo, the clock wonder for a cathedral tower. Every morning he climbed 120 stairs to wonder mechanism that chimed approximately, but not exactly on the hour. Sometimes it was early, sometimes it was late. One day, it chimed 13 times. The town panicked. Hugo blamed the wind. Even candle clocks were used. Burn a marked candle, and you could see how much time passed. But those required wax, and who could afford wasting wax for curiosity? Time was also deeply spiritual. Your hours were not just passing, they were judged. Wasted time was a sin. Idleness was frowned upon, but so was overworking. Moderation was the ideal, unless you were poor, in which case you had no choice. Let's meet Father Alaric, a monk who believed every moment should be a prayer. He once timed the entire monastery's day with a sand glass, the size of a pumpkin. One day, he knocked it over during matins. The monks celebrated, they got an unexpected nap. And while time felt flexible, it was also terrifyingly finite. People knew life was short. Every toll of the bell might be for a friend. Every shadow stretch might mean you forgot a chore. Every sunset meant you might not see the next. So people developed ways to mark moments more than minutes. Weddings, births, deaths, feast days, storms, market flukes, moon eclipses. These were the landmarks of memory. Let's meet Ainor, a washerwoman who remembered everything based on disasters. The year the bridge collapsed, the week the fish turned sour, the day the bishop sneezed and dropped the host. It sounds chaotic, and it was. But it was also intimate. People lived close to their time, feeling it, rather than chasing it. A rooster crowing meant bread was ready. A shadow's tilt meant your husband was late. A candle stub meant prayers were done. Time was felt, not forced, until the modern clock arrived. Ticking, measuring, standardizing, and slowly everything changed. But back then, in that loud, filthy, dying, praying, laughing city, you didn't wear a watch. You watched the sky. You didn't run late. You just arrived. When you arrived. And if someone asked what time it was, you said, almost dark. Better finish your ale. So you've danced with death, debated with chickens, and survived the city's rhythmless chaos. But let's say, just say, you're one of the lucky ones. You haven't died of plague, you haven't starved, and you haven't been arrested for owning a hat that looked too expensive. There's still one more threat that creeps in, quietly, inevitably, and with a quill. The medieval city bureaucracy. Let's meet Recenza, a widow who inherited her husband's candle shop. She lit the city for 12 winters, but when she tried to renew her store license, she was told her paperwork was improperly witnessed. Her witness, a monk. Still not good enough. She waited 3 months. The shop was reassigned to a cousin of the mayor. Welcome to medieval red tape. No color coding, just endless parchment, wax seals, and men with dusty robes, who always seem to be out for prayer. Want to build something? Pay a fee. Submit a sketch. Get it approved by the guild. Get it stamped by the council. Then wait for someone to inspect it, disapprove it, and ask for a bribe. Historians still argue whether medieval urban administrations genuinely believed in civic order or just enjoyed making people beg. It's likely both. Let's meet Eudes, a stonemason hired to repair a fountain. After 3 months of work, he was told he needed a masonry execution permit, then a public water flow license, then a blessing from the archdeacon, Because the fountain depicted a fish that vaguely resembled a biblical one. He gave up. The fountain collapsed. Children still drink from the puddle. Paperwork in a medieval city wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. A missing name or wrong title could cost you your stall, your trade, or your home. And since most people were illiterate, they depended on scribes, men who charged a coin per word, mumbled Latin under their breath, and wrote like they were casting spells. Sometimes they were. Fringe detail. A few cities had notarial archives, stone vaults that stored every agreement, birth, sale, and accusation. Some of these survive today. Others were eaten by mold or goats. Let's meet Mabel, a dyer's daughter who wanted to marry a spice seller. The city required proof of age, parish approval, guild blessing, and at least 2 witnesses who weren't relatives. One witness died, the other went on pilgrimage. The couple waited 2 years. They married in secret. Their son was declared illegitimate. He later became mayor. City bureaucracy wasn't just about rules. It was about who you knew. If your uncle cleaned the bishop's boots, your tavern got inspected once a year. If not, the inspector came weekly, and always after lunch, when he was full and judgmental. Let's meet Tessin, a pig herder whose pigs kept escaping. The city fined him for unguided pork. He pleaded for mercy. The judge demanded a map of his fence. Tessin drew one with charcoal on a cabbage leaf. The court was not amused. Permits, tolls, licenses, approvals. You needed permission for things you didn't know needed permission, like owning more than 3 chickens, or using a ladder longer than a cart, or playing bagpipes past dusk. Yes, that was real. In some cities, bagpipes were regulated, not banned. Regulated. Let's meet Drogo, a bagpiper, fined for unrestrained melody. His defense? The tunes from my homeland. The court debated whether his homeland existed. It was decided, only in song. The fine stood. And then came taxes. Not just the big ones, tithes to the church, rents to the Lord, but dozens of micro-taxes, a tax on fish sold on Fridays, a toll for bringing wood across the bridge, a fee for setting up a stall during rain, a filth disposal tariff for sweeping trash into the river. Let's meet Rixind, a broom maker taxed for each broom she sold outside the market gate. So she sold handles in one spot and brush heads in another. Her customers connected the dots. The officials never did. Every transaction had a rule. Every rule had an exception. Every exception required an official to interpret it. And those officials, human, prone to bribes, prone to naps, prone to suddenly declaring the day's list is full. Let's meet Gorsalm, a parchment scribe who once denied 50 applications in a row because his candle went out and he refused to fetch another. When asked why, he said, "I obey the light. It has abandoned me." And still, despite the absurdity, people kept filing, because beneath the stink and shouts and chickens was a deep belief. If you had the right paper stamped, witnessed, and blessed, you mattered. Without it, you were nobody. So you waited, you paid, you refiled. You found a cousin who knew a man who'd once delivered a fig to the clerk's aunt. You did what you had to do, because in the medieval city, bureaucracy wasn't just frustrating. It was the invisible wall inside the walls. By now, your boots are worn, your nerves are frayed, your patience? That packed up and left somewhere back in Section 7. You've survived every grotesque, bizarre, and baffling facet of life in a medieval city, from lice to laws, from disease to deadlines that weren't deadlines. And yet, there's one more element you haven't escaped. The noise. Let's meet Calixte, a candle maker who lived above her shop near the city square. Every morning she was jolted awake by the blacksmith's hammer. Every night she fell asleep to drunkards arguing about theology. In between, it was babies, beggars, bell towers, bakers shouting about buns, and one rooster who clearly had no idea when dawn was. Medieval cities were loud, unbearably loud. Stone echoed, streets amplified, and walls didn't insulate. They just bounced the sounds back at you like a cruel acoustic joke. Historians still argue whether people simply became desensitized or if the noise helped mask deeper social tensions. Maybe both. Here's what you'd hear in a day. Carts rumbling over cobblestones that were more suggestion than surface. Vendors yelling about fish, fowl, flowers, fabrics, sometimes all at once. Street musicians tooting horns, beating drums, plucking lutes with more heart than talent. Dogs barking, pigs squealing, goats chewing on boots they shouldn't be near. Public arguments, sometimes theatrical, sometimes threatening. And of course, the bells. Bells for hours. Bells for births. Bells for death. Bells. Because the bell ringer was bored. Let's meet Odalric, a cobbler who once shouted so loudly at his apprentice that the nearby monk scribes miswrote 2 lines of scripture. Odalric didn't apologize. The monks revised the lines to include "Beware of bad shoes." Fringe detail? Some cities had noise ordinances, but only after midnight, and only during Lent, and only if the offender wasn't a noble, a priest, or someone with a very large ladle. Even your home wasn't safe. No double-glazed windows, no insulation, just thin walls, open shutters, and a roof that let in both sound and birds. Let's meet Yuzabo, a laundress whose neighbor practiced lute every evening, badly. After 3 weeks of terrible scales, she finally snapped and threw a shoe through the window. It hit the lute. Both survived. Their friendship did not. The city was never silent. Not at dawn, when bakers lit their fires and shouted for wood. Not at dusk, when neighbors aired grievances about pigs in doorways. Not even during Mass, when the faithful whispered, the distracted coughed, and the children tried to wrestle saints carved into pews. And on feast days, forget about it. Let's meet Rombau, a butcher who hated St. John's Day because the fireworks spooked his oxen. One year, a frightened ox ran through the bakery and straight into the bathhouse. The mayor declared it divine punishment. The ox was pardoned. But amid the chaos, there were brief silences. A snowfall, a funeral, a prayer whispered in an empty alley. Let's meet Tybalt, a blind old scholar who could identify the time of day by the sounds of his street. The chimney sweeps come at prime, the wool carts roll at tercer, the children sing at none. The silence at vespers means someone has died. It was rare, but precious, because silence in the medieval city wasn't the default, it was the exception. And you cherished it when it came, like now. You've made it, through 35 sections of stink, scream, soot, sorrow, sewage, superstition, and at least 3 suspicious sausages. You know now why it sucked to live in a medieval city. And yet, something in you remains curious. You wonder how they did it. How anyone could live so loud, so raw, so exposed, and still sing at sunset. Still laugh over spoiled stew. Still pray for a better morning. Maybe it's because they didn't know any different. Maybe it's because even when life was loud and short and unfair, it was still life. A noisy, nasty, noble thing to hold on to. So tonight, as the world quiets around you, and your own city fades to soft hums and dim lights, let the final bells of that far-off medieval city ring once more in your memory. Distant, imperfect, but undeniably human. Let's slow down now. Breathe out the noise, the soot, the weight of centuries. Let it all drift, like smoke curling up from a chimney that's finally gone cold. You've walked cobbled streets with no end and no order. You've ducked under thatched eaves. You've listened to the clash of hammers, the rustle of robes, the gossip in the breadline, the coughs in the chapel. You've seen people scrape by with barely a coin to their name, but carry stories in their hearts like gold. Let those stories settle around you now. Dim, gentle, fleeting. Time felt different there. So let time feel slower now. Let your breaths match the sway of old shop signs, creaking in wind that smells of smoke and soup. You're not in that city anymore, but maybe a part of you understands it now. The chaos, the clutter, the cruel beauty of people surviving one impossible day after another without ever knowing the word medieval, because to them, it was just life. Maybe, as the sounds fade, you feel something else. Not pity, not revulsion, but connection. The same moon that lit those cobbled streets still hangs above you. The same wind that shook their shutters presses softly at your window. And now you safe, warm, still, can close your eyes. The bells are quiet, The boots are off. The fire's gone to embers. And somewhere in a city that no longer stands, the night finally falls quiet.